Can you hear us?
Yeah, can you hear me?
We can hear you fine. We're hearing you good. How are you doing today?
Oh, pretty good.
Perfect. All right. Well, we're gonna have people joining in and out, and then it helps us kind of boost the live, so you'll see people on the side here. Change the layout again if you want. Yeah, I think I'm just going to keep it like this. That way we can keep reminding everyone. All right. So I wanted to have you introduce yourself to the live to everyone here so they get to know you a little bit and your passions and what you studied and why you studied it, because I think that's really important. So if you want to introduce yourself, you can go ahead.
Sure. So I'm Liam O'Mara. I'm a historian, but I'm sure Dominic has said that repeatedly. I'm what they call a historian of ideas, which means I study big systems of thought and cultures and whatnot. My major research areas, physically, regionally, would be the Middle East and Europe, although I teach a bunch of thematic world history classes because, again, historian of cultures and ideas, so I teach classes on the history of sexuality and shit like that, that kind of bounce all over the world. My passions you asked about, I guess what got me into history in the first place, and specifically this type of history, was a desire to understand humans, why do we do the fucked up shit that we do? I mean, some of that started from a very personal issue, from childhood. I mean, I'm autistic, which is probably why I fidget a lot. But I grew up kind of confused by everybody. What the hell is this crazy planet I'm on? And that got me interested in studying people and psychology and everything else. And that just sort of kept snowballing over the course of my life. So I studied philosophy and economics and, biology and just tons and tons of other things. But history for me is like the center of a spider web that everything connects to, because it's just change over time is history. And I get to look at all these different big ideas and look at how they change over time. So that's the short, I guess.
That's perfect. And then, Rima, you want to let the crowd know, because you know it better, the best way for...
Yeah. First of all, Liam, thank you so much for using your voice and being here with us today. I'm sorry I sound like a man. I was up for 24 hours on live. God bless my heart. But I am a woman, in fact. Thank you so much. Everyone in the chat, now that we have made Liam on the bigger screen, in order to keep the live pushing out onto the For You page, you must tap Dominic's face. Continue tapping Dominic's face throughout the live. Keep the chat flooded with comments. And please send all donations to Liam for using his voice. So thank you so much. And thank you everyone who's here. Any racist or hatred comments will be muted and blocked out of the live. And again, you must continue to tap Dominic's face. Okay, I'm going back on mute.
You're good. This ugly face. Okay. And so, Liam, this is really good because there's two things I want to do before we dive into the whole Q&A part, which is kind of get a background of what you've done in your life to kind of get people an understanding. Because sometimes when I talk about things, they always go have you been there? Do you speak Arabic? And I have to waste my time going, okay, so do you want to talk a little bit about your time in the Middle East? Have you been to the Middle East? Where have you been and why you went?
Sure. Well, the why is easy to do research, and if you're interested, I can point out the specific projects that I got sucked into while I was there. But yeah, I've been in a number of countries. I've spent time in Egypt, Israel, Palestine, Jordan. I want to say I went into Syria, but I technically didn't. It's a weird story there. And then Turkey, I guess in that region. And yeah, the thing that I was there a number of times. I've spent multiple summers, and based in different parts. So sometimes staying on the Palestinian side, in refugee camps in Palestinian and Israeli Arab cities, and sometimes staying in Israeli cities, and then sometimes in mixed areas. Like I was based one summer up in Haifa and then traveled around from there. I was studying the impact of the settlers on the social fabric and the ecology of the West Bank. Like, what is their impact there, and how is it changing the people who live there? Specifically looking at the very religious populations, the so-called ultra-Orthodox or Haredim. How are they becoming more nationalistic? How are they, following more and more of the racist politics of Israel since they've gotten involved in the settler project? And then in another year, I was there, specifically in the wake of the 2011 Arab uprisings, which is, also something that I was studying and teach a course on, sort of contextualizing these uprisings, why they happened and whatnot. So I was bouncing around from country to country talking to tons of activists. And that meant everything from like the Gezi Park protests in Turkey to the Occupy protests in Israel to obviously Tahrir Square in Egypt. And I just met tons of like, activists. Why are you here? What's going on? Like, how are you going to change this, the world that you're in?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I've been there. I've spent quite a few summers in the region.
Perfect. Okay, that's good. Yeah, because that's something that people always ask and they want to know. And although it doesn't matter when you do research on these topics, but being there can give a sense of like, okay, I trust him a little bit more. He's been there. So
right.
We're going to go over a number of different topics, but I wanted to go over it the typical way that everyone does and kind of just go in order. But I want to do something a little bit different, which is there are a lot of people here who are religious and go straight off the religious text, and they want to follow it to the T. And what does the Bible say? What does the Torah say? What does the Quran say? So when I ask certain questions that are relative to it, I want to go over like how that would be viewed, that question via, let's say, the Torah, and then how that question is viewed during like neutral historians of like, here's what archaeology and kind of historians say.
Yeah. All right.
So
yeah, sure. Yeah, it's actually a fun one for me because I've always kept one foot in the ancient world, one foot in the modern world. I do a lot of research projects that deal with like ancient history.
Yeah, and then that's important because, like, for example, when we talked about this, which we were talking about this a couple like last week, which was like, hey, like, were there Jewish people in the land of Canaan? And like historically, yes, but technically from the Torah, no. Like, and then and I want to kind of like address it from those both points. Just so someone goes, hey, I don't believe anything except the Torah. They think, okay, well then this is what that says. And so I like to always hit it from both points. So let's talk a little bit about it. And I had pulled up a research paper and was reading it entirely on the migration of people from Africa, North Africa, into the Levant area, and that was like their first Arabs. They were in like the Sinai, and that was like the first Arabs they considered it. It was this whole research thing. I put in my link in my bio. So can you talk a little bit about the formation of Arabs and what defines Arabs?
Okay, I first need to figure out exactly what it is you're asking. Do you mean the first time peoples moved into that area, or the first time people speaking a Semitic language migrated into that area?
Well, that actually leads me to the question, which is like, how do you, as a historian, as someone who studies this, how do you define it? Where do you go? Okay, these were Arabs. Like, this is what we consider Arabs. Like, and what is the difference between that?
Well, Arabs are defined as people who speak a form of Arabic. So it would ultimately be people from Arabia, and then through the later spread outward through the Arab conquest, and they took a big chunk of territory from the Eastern Roman Empire and toppled the Sassanid Persian Empire and spread across North Africa. Those would be Arabs. Anything before that point, we don't really think of as Arabs, but there are speakers of Semitic languages, of which Arabic is one. There's tons of previous Semitic languages that have gone extinct, tons of important historical ones, and also a handful that are still alive today. So it's a broader language family. And that started thousands of years before the Arab conquests.
Got it. And then as we move forward, let's just say jumping ahead towards the land of Canaan, right? Canaanites. Who were the Canaanites, and where does the Arab and Jewish split happen? How does that happen from a Torah's perspective, and then how does it happen from a historian's perspective?
Oh gosh, okay. This is so we got to then back this up a little bit because it's getting a little confused. So let's start with the fact that this has always been a historical crossroads. People sort of migrating out of here as soon as human beings managed to wander up out of Africa and spread out. I mean, the two main ways out were through the Levant and then crossing the lower Red Sea and across from Yemen. And tons of people have flown out from there over a very long period of time. Our species permanently moved into the area about 50,000 some years ago. And some people started settling there immediately in Palestine, as well as like continuing to move further and further on. Archaeologically, we look back at, because obviously most of the time you're hunter-gatherers, but we have, going back something like 15,000 some years, like the development of the Natufian cultures. That would be the first peoples actually living in the area that we call Israel, Palestine today. So places like Jericho in the West Bank have been continuously inhabited for 11,000 years. So long before there were such a thing as Canaanites or Jews or Arabs or anything else, there were people living in Jericho. So there's a continuous wave of transformation in cultures and languages. Somebody had asked, I saw it scrolling by earlier in the chat there, about people being Arabized during the Arab conquest. Yeah, that's the case. So originally Syrians and Egyptians and Moroccans and Iraqis, they weren't Arabs. They became Arabs because large numbers of them adopted Islam and hence the Quran and learned the language, and it slowly replaced the languages that were there already. Genetically, the Arabs of Arabia didn't settle in large numbers anywhere. But anyway, this is a process that's been going on all through human existence. So what'll become the Canaanite peoples, speaking a Semitic language, that goes back a bit over 4,000 years. And that creates a settled civilization that stretches from the southern part of Israel, Palestine, all the way through the northern part of Syria. So all through the Levant, you've got settlement there, developing what we call the Canaanite civilization. And for anybody that's familiar with the term Canaanite and Phoenician, they mean the same thing. We tend to use the term Phoenician for the northern part and Canaanite for the southern part, but that's only because of our sources. So, I mean, we get Phoenician out of Greek because they interacted with the Greeks. We get Canaanite out of the Bible because they interacted with the later Hebrews and blah, blah, blah. So we have two names for the same exact population. And that people is actually the origin of what will become Jews. The original language, spoken language, the original writing system, if you're doing archaeology in Israel, Palestine, you dig back to first temple type eras. You go way back into like the Torah era, and you're digging up signs and seals and bits of inscriptions and whatnot. The writing system that they're using that we call Paleo-Hebrew in that archaeology, that's the Phoenician writing system. It's absolutely identical to the Phoenician writing system that we see to the north and what is today like Lebanon and Syria.
Yeah.
So it's originally a single shared civilization speaking a range of dialects in the same basic Semitic language, all through that region. And then over time, the cultures are going to start diverging. So that'll give us a starting point for your other questions, because I'm sure you want to start asking about where do Jews come from and that sort of thing. But we got to start with, we have to put the Canaanites on the ground. So there's that.
Yeah, and that was my focus. It's like, okay, like defining. So I've been reading studies basically showing that DNA test shows like the people who are connected to them are mostly Lebanese, a little bit of Syrian, a little bit of Palestinian. It's kind of a mixture. It looks like the strongest group is Lebanese that are strongly related to Phoenicians. But who were the Canaanites? What did they speak? What would we consider them looking back?
Well, the Canaani or Canaanites are the original population all through the Levant. So realistically, they are the original inhabitants of all of Western Syria and Lebanon and Israel, Palestine. And what starts to happen over time is they begin to diverge a bit culturally. There's other waves of migration, other peoples that settle in the area that then they'll mix and merge and there'll be alterations here. Later languages will develop in the area. But your starting point, population-wise, is going to be Canaanite all through that area. And that's the populations that, for the most part, have fully assimilated the earlier Neolithic populations. So it's become an entirely Canaanite cultural area, and then certain parts of it will start breaking off and heading off in different areas. So like the Aramaean populations will break off later from that. What'll become the Jews will break off from that. Yeah. But the starting point throughout the entire Levant is Canaanite and / Phoenician. Again, the words are interchangeable, so use whatever you want.
Got it. And so looking through a Torah's perspective and framework, what was their story of how where they came from, because it's a much shorter, less complex story than obviously the real story of like them diverging from the Canaanites. What is the Torah's perspective of where Jewish people came from, where they went, and then who was on the land when they got there? From that perspective.
Well, Torah's perspective begins with, well, I guess if you're trying to develop the Hebrew people, so set aside like the earlier, like, you know, Adam and Eve and all that kind of shit, and just start with our first patriarch. Avram is, or will become Avraham, aka Abraham, is from Ur of the Chaldees. He's from Mesopotamia. So he's from, you know, southern Mesopotamia, and, you know, he makes a deal, and the Holy Land is sort of like, you know, offered to him and his descendants, and that's the beginning of that. And then it says there's a period where they lived in Egypt for a while, and then they moved back in and took the territory and fought the Canaanites and took control of it. And then there's a single united area, and then it breaks into, you know, two competing states. That's the Torah narrative in a nutshell. All of that is... I mean, there's no polite way to say this, so apologies to any biblical literalists, but all of it is national mythology, because all of these texts are written much, much later. They reflect the interest of the people much, much later to try and create origin stories for themselves, and out of that we can see what kind of interest they had, what the reason that they did certain things, and detect at different points when parts of the narratives were written, but none of it was intended by the people who wrote it to be history. I mean, Abraham is a mythical figure. Whether there was really an Abraham, I mean, if you want to think of one, but even if you look at the one actually in the Bible, he's not a monotheist. Yeah. I mean, Moses, a little bit easier to say, maybe there's a historical figure at the core of it, but just as likely Moses too could be a composite written much later to describe part of a process by which certain elements of Egyptian and Midianite culture end up influencing the population in the lower Levant. So Moses is useful to explain that. I mean, Moshe very likely as a word has its origins in the Egyptian language, and elements of the religion that he brings in. The worship of however you want to say it, Yahweh, Jehovah, the Yud He Vav He name for God. That's a god that was previously worshipped already to the southeast, in Midian. And the story actually has Moses marrying the daughter of a Midianite priest, and then he carries the story in that El and Yahweh are the same god, but El is the original Canaanite sky god. So the oldest name for God that's present in the Hebrew Bible, you asked earlier about languages. Yes, I do read these languages in both ancient and modern forms. The oldest form of God's name, El, is the Canaanite high god or sky god. And then there's various forms of El, like Elohim, which is like El and the council of gods. So El and the other, like kind of like the Olympians, the other top gods. Then there's like, you know, El Elyon, El the Most High, or El Shaddai, El of the mountains. There's like various forms of name that show up there. But El's the old name of God. Moses, from that point on, brings in a blending together of two different God concepts. And then out of that combination, you develop a distinct population that we can really recognize as Hebrew. They've begun to diverge a little bit earlier on in a few ritual practices, but it's really from that period on that there's a significant difference. So it starts with a religious concept, but the populations, you started with basically, you've made a reference to DNA. The people that become the Jewish people and the Canaanite population that was there, they're the same people. They start as the same population. All of the narratives about a conquest under Joshua and whatnot, no one's found any evidence that really suits that. The biblical narrative of conquest doesn't really fit. There's like centuries before that point, there's already a people calling themselves Israel living in that land. They emerged out of that population.
Got it. And then where do the Arabs merge? How are they connected with the Canaanites? Can you give us that little backstory?
The Arabs are a more complicated one for this specifically, because, again, Arabic is a different Semitic language, distinct from the Canaanite Phoenician one. And when we think about Arabs, they're peoples that were still down in Arabia, and then You get up into there's the 7th century waves of conquest, taking territory, and then their version of language spreads into the area. They weren't actually a literate people at the time either. They had a powerful oral tradition, but they adopted and developed a writing system based upon late Aramaic and Syriac, came up with their own writing system, started documenting things, and developed a literary language that gave us the Quran. And then from that, spread their language over a wider area. So over time, the population that was still in that area, because we're skipping over quite a lot in order to get to Arabs. The tons of later developments amongst the early Hebrew states, and then Greek periods, Egyptian periods, Roman periods. But eventually you have a population that lives in that area that speaks a different descendant Semitic language, Aramaic. And those Aramaic speakers in the area, they're the ones who adopt Arabic and become Arabs in Palestine. But the people who are Palestinian, they had earlier spoken Aramaic. And before that, many of them spoke Hebrew. And, it just goes back and back and back. They're the same people. They just later adopted Arabic.
Yeah, and that's what I kind of wanted to talk about, which is, people kind of, and I think we talked about this too, is people kind of go oh, we were their first quote unquote, and I said, who's we, right? At some point when you go far enough, we are one. So where do you draw the difference, and where do you go, okay, now we're our own thing? And so this, somebody kind of asked this in there, which is, when did being Jewish become an ethnicity? What was it, just a religion? What kind of changed that? Why define Jewish? You know what I mean?
Okay, so a lot of the at the earliest stages in the Torah narrative, the peoples wouldn't have recognized themselves as Jews. Jewish didn't exist as a distinct religious civilization in much of the biblical narrative. That's kind of ex post facto read into it. Our term Jew comes from the southern state of Judah, but while the biblical narrative has them as a single state, under the Saul, David, and Solomon, and then breaking apart into two, archaeology and the textual analysis shows us that Yisrael and Judah were always separate states. And they were just spoke a related form of that Semitic language. So and you can still see some of that in some of your Palestinian listeners might be aware of the Samaritan population, because the largest chunk of them still live up near Nablus. There's not many of them left. There's 300 or 400 Samaritans left. They used to be a significant population, though. Samaritans are very likely descendants of portions of the northern population of Yisrael who didn't adopt the later understanding of the religion that came out of Judah. But what'll become the Jews, it's really out of the culture of the southern state, the one centered on Jerusalem and the northern part of the desert parts of the hill country.
Yeah, and
that area takes on a very distinct character, largely because of the destruction of the north by the Assyrians, and then starts to come up with a new understanding of its relationship with God during its own captivity under the Chaldeans, especially once the Persians defeat the Chaldeans and they're exposed to Zoroastrianism, which is a much older religion that it worships only one God. It's dualistic, so there's a good God and a bad God, but you only worship the good God, obviously. So yeah. It's for all practical terms, it's kind of monotheistic, and it's from that time that we start to see the prophetic writings like Isaiah that talk about there being only one God. All of the earlier writings that are preserved in the Hebrew Bible are at best henotheistic. So there's tons of gods, but we chose to worship this one and not to shop around anymore.
Got it. Okay.
But you start to see the development of a distinct monotheistic culture in the aftermath of that captivity. And it's really as a satrapy in the Persian Empire that Judah develops a distinct cultural identity of its own that encompasses the territory all across the hill country, so the north and the south united in a single province of the Persian Empire. And it's from that point on that there's a distinct cultural identity we can kind of point to as Jewish. It's very different from the way we would understand Judaism today, because it's a temple cult, there's a priesthood, there's a Davidic monarchy, there's all kinds of specific things about it. But it's from the Persian period on that we have a distinct Jewish culture, and it's preserved through the Greek period, through the Roman period, and thereafter.
Got it. And then this kind of, the temple thing leads me to a good question, which I'm bringing up questions that we get as Palestinians that I want to get addressed from a more historian perspective, which is, I hear this all the time, which is, quote unquote, it's our land because we were the first to build temples there. So what's the truth to that statement, that Jewish people were the first to build temples in modern day Palestine, Israel?
I'm honestly shocked that anyone could say something like that, especially since the Bible itself has discussion of the state of Judah destroying previous temples. I mean, like King Josiah smashing the altars at Beth Shean. I mean, obviously there was a temple for him to smash. Hello. So yeah, I don't get that. I mean, there's an extensive polytheistic history in the area. We have drawings of El and his Asherah, so El and his wife. God had a wife. To go way back into the Canaanite period in that area. There's tons of archaeological evidence of earlier polytheistic temples, tons of figurines and statues, and then you have tons of later things like the Egyptians. When they came in there, they left behind. We have cultic signs of theirs they built, in Jaffa. In Jaffa, there are the remains of an Egyptian fort that actually had a temple there, for worship of Egyptian gods. I mean, so it's not just the indigenous. There were tons of polytheistic temples long before the existence of Judaism at all. So I can't even imagine where somebody's getting that line.
Yeah, it's interesting, and that's why I was we were talking about this, and we said these religions compound on each other, right? Take from each other, expand on each other. But people always see it as no, this was the beginning of nothingness. I'm no, it doesn't happen like that. These are all stacked on top of each other. Take a little bit from here and there, and mix it together, which kind of gets complicated, because then it's who are Jewish people? Well, it's complicated. What do you define as Jewish? What parts are you taking in?
Right.
Like you said, it's very similar to what Lebanese and Palestinian. I mean, if you were to tomorrow change the region and make it all one big country, at some point there's going to be mixing between them. But then they are different cultures, but then they are very similar. And then it's, what are you? If you make up a new name, what do we call ourselves? So these are all social constructs in a sense that get very difficult to follow. Right. And that's where I laugh when people go oh, we were there first, or you were there first. And I go, who is we? We are all the same. We were all there at some point. And it's kind of relevant. But now as we move forward, what did happen, so we can start going more modern, what did happen to the two nations of the Jewish population at the time, which are two different groups, as you said, very similar in their language, but still two different kingdoms. What happened to them moving forward as we go through, if you want to do a little run through over the next 2,000 years, leading up to the 1500s.
Oh God!
Every conquest.
So so 1500 BCE to 1500 CE.
Yeah, just going through the major actual conquests, just the first couple, and then we could skip ahead.
Well, so again, setting aside the national mythology that's in Torah about them being originally one people, Israel and Judah were separate territories. The Neo-Assyrian Empire destroys the northern kingdom of Israel, which was by far the more populous, richer. They had a more fertile land. They're wiped out, and then the southern kingdom of Judah, they become vassals. They're oh, we're not going to fight back. They stick along with that, and then in that period, they build up some defenses. They're thinking long term at least. But then the Assyrians themselves are destroyed by a coalition of Chaldeans and Medes. So that's further over in Mesopotamia. So there's a power vacuum. Now, Judah wants to then conquer the area of the north. So it does. It expands up into that area. So that's around the time of you've got reforms in time of Hezekiah, conquest in time of Josiah. A lot of the Torah narrative of Joshua's conquest in the 11th century BC are actually matching, the 7th century type conquests of under Josiah, the description there. But that's when you can talk about a single unified territory. Here's a much larger later Judah based on Jerusalem. That's the one that's defeated by the Chaldeans. Its elites are dragged into Mesopotamia, where they're later heavily influenced by Zoroastrianism. Those elites come back and create a Persian province within the Persian Empire of Judah. That Persian province is later going to be conquered by the Greeks because of Alexander. So then it becomes part of first the Ptolemaic state based in Egypt, and then the Seleucid state in the north. Then it breaks off and creates the Hasmonean monarchy. And we're running through a lot of history very fast here.
Oh, that's fine.
The Hasmonean monarchy is the last actual Jewish temple state. So there's a functioning temple there. And this, the second temple is built with Persian money, basically. The Persian Empire, gave the cash to rebuild the temple that had been destroyed by the Chaldeans. But the Hasmoneans are kind of running this temple state based in this area here as a last independent state. And then they get sucked into the Roman world. And it becomes like a Roman province of Judea. That'll eventually give us the name Palestine because when the Jews rebel against the Romans repeatedly, eventually the Romans are like, fuck this. They burn down Jerusalem. They rebuild it as Aelia Capitolina. They start banning Judaism. That caused a massive diaspora. Tons of people flow out of it to different parts of the empire and beyond. And the Roman province of Judea, or Judah, becomes like Syria Palestina. That Palestina is actually named for a shorter-lived population that we call the Philistines, which were actually, their name for themselves would have been Peliset. They were centered on the area where, like, the Gaza Strip stretches up through, like, Ashdod and Ashkelon in, like, southwest Israel. And that population hadn't existed for a long time as a distinct culture. Their language had eventually, they'd been assimilated. They became Aramaic speakers, too. So they blended into the larger whole much later. But the Romans renamed the province for this extinct population that had lived in a small part of it as a kind of like, fuck you to the rebellious Jews. And then moving toward the Arab period, the Samaritans actually continued rebelling even after the Jews had been wiped out, and they keep getting crushed and their population is going down. So basically the population that's in the area has been assimilated multiple times through different cultures. So, I mean, you've got Aramaic speakers, Greek speakers in the area. By the time you get to the Arab conquests, a late form of Aramaic is still the majority language in the area. Although some people spoke Greek, some people spoke Syriac and a few other related languages in the area. But that population that was left gets Arabized. They slowly adopt the Arabic language. And irrespective of religion, too, people tend to forget that in the initial waves of Arab conquest, most people didn't convert. It was a very slow process. I mean, big countries like Egypt were majority Christian for centuries into the Arab period. And the last villages that spoke a form of the ancient Egyptian language didn't finally give it up until the 18th century. It took a long time to finally die out and be replaced by Arabic, too. But in some areas, it's a quicker process. The Arabic language is adopted relatively quickly in the area that becomes Palestine. But the area is majority Christian for a long time, and then just slowly becomes majority Muslim. But there's the Christians that are there today, like Christian Palestinians, they're descendants of people that were Christians, 1,800 years ago.
Yeah, which is what I am. We're from Ramallah. We're Palestinian Christians.
Right. So they've been Christians for a long, long time. But the language spoken by your ancestors was eventually given up, and you guys adopted Arabic without changing without changing the religion. And
then, which is a good question too. This is something that we hear a lot, which is Jewish people from the get-go have been targeted by Arabs and Muslims throughout the entire history, basically being picked on over and over again. What's the truth to this? Is there truth? Was it specifically to Jewish people? Was it everyone conquesting each other? What is that theme of this idea that we do hear some people say that, like, for thousands of centuries, it was Jews being picked on and attacked over and over again, kind of thing?
Yeah, that's a weird displacement of Christianity's relationship to Judaism. Christianity has theological reasons to dislike Judaism. The early Christian church developed a theology of supersession that said they are the new Israel, they're the chosen people of God, and the Jews who rejected their Messiah are cast out by God. And that process takes centuries, actually. I mean, it's not really until the 4th century that Jesus or the Christ actually becomes God. Before that, it was kind of a minority position, too. It just slowly took off as the main approach to it. But the church by that point has basically accused all Jews for all time of collectively being responsible for killing God. And therefore, they can only survive to be kind of like kicked around and abused. So there's a kind of people sometimes people will talk about it as like a Christian anti-Semitism. I tend to differentiate between anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism. Anti-Judaism has a theological basis that's there in its earliest forms from the 2nd century. Anti-Semitism is a racism developed in the 19th century as nationalism is developing in Europe. But they both hate Jews, so just for different reasons. Islam does not actually have a theological reason to hate either religion. Islam actually recognizes that Christianity and Judaism are both legitimate revelations from God. The way it understands it is that, well, we think that some people just screwed up at some point and wrote things down wrong, so God had to keep sending new prophets to like fix those mistakes. But it does recognize that it is a revealed religion, and therefore they're peoples of the book, they're peoples of God, they're Ahl al-Kitab. And as far as Islam is concerned, God will sort all that shit out. It is impossible from a Muslim perspective for Christians or Jews to be infidels. They just can't be because they worship God.
Yeah, because one of the other things we hear a lot, and so basically, like, what I want to address is kind of bring up the propaganda conspiracy questions that we get as Arabs and how that relates to reality. So I'm asking just very stupid questions, but I want them to be answered correctly, which is we hear that in the Quran it says like it's a war and that Muslims have to kill Jews. Like this is what their duty is. We hear this a lot. And where does that narrative even stem from? Is that even true, or is it just completely cultural conspiracy?
It's not. It's misunderstandings from it. It's pulling things out of context. Honestly, and this is a problem that most Muslims will have in the same way that most Christians and most Jews will have in looking at their texts, is they're not familiar enough with the history around it to really understand what's happening and the context for it. So what they have to depend upon is however a particular preacher is framing it. If you sit down and read Quran, like the passages jump all over the place in time, they're poems, it's not easy to read. It's not a linear narrative. Yeah. And the parts where it talks about killing Jews is related to specific political problems with Jews. The earliest revelation of Islam actually, they prayed with Jews. They prayed north toward Jerusalem. The first direction of prayer was toward Jerusalem. Later the faith gets more Arabized and it turns around and aims toward the Kaaba, but initially it's toward Jerusalem. And one of the biggest splits between them, where I would place a definitive split, is around the time of the Battle of Uhud, where you had different Jewish tribes in Yathrib, aka Medina, and they were part of the Ummah. They were part of the community of the faithful. So they had a common responsibility along with Muslims to defend the city against the polytheists if there was a fight. When the Meccans have come and surrounded it, there's emissaries that sneak in to try and talk to the Jewish tribes and try to convince them to be like a fifth column threat and attack from behind. And one of the tribes is like, fuck you, we made a deal, we're not going to talk to you at all. But another one's like, come on in, we'll hear what you got to say. And then, okay, that seems interesting. They don't go for it. They don't actually attack the Muslims, but they also don't fight to defend the city. They just sit on their hands during that battle. And in the aftermath, and this is an atrocity, Muhammad orders them massacred. The women and children are enslaved. The men are all butchered. And that's the end of that. The tribes that stayed loyal, they weren't killed. Because, again, there's no theological reason to dislike Jews or Judaism. But from that point, you can see a recognition on the part of the Muslims that the Jews are not going to recognize Muhammad as a prophet in their tradition, that it is a distinct approach to it, and that the Jews cannot be trusted to be part of the community as a whole, even though they can be trusted to be like, citizens, taxpayers, whatever, and are generally ignored in later Muslim states. They're always present there. Jews, in fact, frequently have significant social positions in later Arab and Muslim states, but they're understood to be just this earlier people of the book and not part of the same community. They can't be trusted to be part of this larger Muslim community. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and
so there are massacres, there is butchery, there are attacks on Jews, but it's not because they're Jews. It's for these different political fights.
Got it. And this is something that's perfect, which kind of leads me to a kind of a more modern question. But we hear this a lot, and you know, there's no bias here, which is like, what was the relationship like as we move forward, let's say, into the Ottoman Empire between Jewish people? Because what we hear a lot, and I think it's ironic, is people, when we debate topics, they'll talk about how Palestinians are equal in Israel under the law, blah, blah, blah. And then they'll use the argument of how could they be ever disadvantaged? They're in politics, their whole positions, they do this, they do that. But you kind of related this very similar to Jewish people in the Muslim culture. They held positions, they did this, they did that. Can you talk about Jewish people under the Caliphate and what that looked like, let's say, under the Ottomans?
In neither case, whether the modern one, and we should talk about that kind of stuff later, or these earlier times, in neither case is there actual equality. The Jews and Christians under earlier forms of caliphate, whether you're talking about Rashidun, Umayyad, Abbasid, or like the last Ottoman caliphate, so I'm thinking of like the Sunni caliphates, in none of them were Jews able to be the full social equal of Muslims, but they could still achieve high position. They could still do pretty well for themselves. But there always is a separation, because it's an understanding that these are essentially Islamic states, Islamic empires. In that way,
what about Christians and Jews?
Exactly the same situation. Full legal equality doesn't happen anywhere in the Muslim world until the 19th century during an Ottoman reform. There's always the different protected peoples, the different dhimmi peoples. They have tons of rights. They can maintain their houses of worship. They have a different tax. Instead of paying zakat, they'll pay jizya. So they're contributing to the state, but they are understood to be different, and they're not the social equal of Muslims, even though they're not overtly persecuted either.
Got it. Okay.
So, I mean, again, they're religious states. I mean, and realistically, the Muslim world at the time, while it's not going to offer full legal and social equality to peoples of different religions, it's certainly better than the Christian world, which didn't even tolerate different religions, and tended just to kill people outright. Or, I mean, it's states before the modern period are generally ruled in ways that make it impossible to have the kind of secular tolerance we take for granted today. It's just not true anyway.
This kind of brings me back. We'll jump back for a second and then start moving forward. During the quote-unquote Jewish kingdoms, right? You said Judah and Kingdom of Israel. What were other religions living there? How were they treated? What was that system?
So that's okay. So you're bouncing again way back before the Greek period. Even that far back, you can see tensions, and this you can see in the split between Judaism and Samaritanism, because they both have Torah. The first 5 books of the Bible are common to both of them. In fact, the Samaritan Torah is still written in Paleo-Hebrew. It's still written in characters that look like Phoenician, and they still practice animal sacrifice and have a priesthood. So they're basically a tiny remnant of a much, much older interpretation of the religion that's still gone through some of the transformation and become essentially monotheistic, but it still holds to some of the practices that have faded out elsewhere. There's tons of tension and fighting back and forth between them. You can actually see a really fun example of that, and Christians will recognize this in the parable of the Good Samaritan, which is one of those nice things where Jesus is basically taking an anti-racist position. He's saying, here's this guy that needs help, and all these people are going by that should be good people that would help out, but they're not. And then finally a Samaritan stops and helps out. And Jesus is saying, look, you can't judge a book by its cover. Even a Samaritan can be a good guy. That story only makes sense true sense. People have tons of different ways of interpreting the modern period, but it makes good sense if you really understand the Jews and Samaritans hated each other. And this is common whenever you have cultures, religions, and whatnot that are very similar. People will fight over the small differences. Think of the way Christians were constantly slaughtering people of different forms of Christianity, different heresies, right? When you agree on most things but have a small area of disagreement, it tends to really piss people off. And Jews and Samaritans agreed on most things, but they had a handful of small differences, and that caused just tremendous tension and hatred between them. So there are different, going all the way back to the beginning, you can see different religions.
Yeah.
Even without going all the way back into the polytheistic period, but even in the period where you're developing distinct monotheisms, that process of developing a monotheistic interpretation essentially happens twice for Judaism and Samaritanism. And in both cases, they're going to reinterpret their earlier, polytheistic and henotheistic texts in a monotheistic way and develop their own distinct traditions there. But there's slight differences, and they don't like each other. And then you complicate that with later waves of Hellenized Jews. So tons of Jews who reinterpret their traditions based upon Greek philosophy. And there's just tons of transformations there that are always going to cause tons of tension. Think about some of the fights that exist within Judaism in the Greek and Roman period, like the fights between the Sadducee interpretations and the Pharisee interpretations. They're both Jews, but they have fundamental differences in interpretation. And then the radical Essene communities living out in the desert that have kind of you guys are all wrong, we're going to go out here and we're going to wait for the Messiah. They didn't agree with anybody either. So religious diversity was always the norm here.
Yeah, and the reason why I asked this was we always, and I try and create understanding for people that they always try and paint this picture of under Muslims we were treated horribly, but Christians and Jews are nice, or reverse. Under Jews they're bad, but the Muslims it was good. And I'm they all treated each other badly in some different ways, but one of the worst was Christians. I learned that a lot.
Okay, so here's a fun one here. Okay, for that specific argument, and honestly, it just tells you what a couple of centuries of secularism will do to people's historical memory, because people are forgetting into the 20th century, most of the people who participated in the Holocaust did so because of Christianity, not because of the racial ideologies. Any good Lutheran or Catholic, of course you're going to hate Jews because you're raised to hate Jews. It was normal. It's really only very recently that they've gotten over that part of it, but the whole loss of historical memory about how these different religions treat each other as a whole. Christians kicked around Jews constantly and treated them like shit. The Romans had earlier kicked the Jews out of Jerusalem, renamed the city, and made it a completely Hellenistic city. And Jews were not permitted to go back and live there. When the Roman Empire became officially Christian, so it's now a Christian state, they weren't any nicer to the Jews. They were harder on the Jews. They maintained those prohibitions. Jews were not allowed to move back to Jerusalem until the Arabs conquered it, because Muslims didn't have a problem with either of these religions. Okay, you guys are both kind of revealed religions. You're both kind of right, but you're also both kind of wrong. And we don't really care between the two of you which one's more wronger than others. It just doesn't matter, So they're fine, you guys can all live here. It doesn't matter. Just pay your taxes and it's fine. So Jews were able to move back to Jerusalem finally only in that period. Islam officially protects the status of Jews, where Jews were subject to constant and random persecution and pogroms under Christianity. So they're very different relationships in terms of how they treated them. This is not to say that Muslims were not sometimes terrible to Jews, because they were. And oftentimes this reflects different political issues. There was a period in the late Mamluk state, so before the Ottomans had conquered Egypt, when they're losing territory, they're weak, they're kind of looking to shore up their support, and then they start officially persecuting Christians and Jews alike. So they're forced to wear distinctive clothes and markers and whatnot, kind of like the way the Europeans forced Jews to wear distinctive clothes. So there are persecutions. There are times when Jews in Morocco, if they walked past a mosque, they had to take off their shoes. They have to get off the road and let Muslims, get out of the road and let Muslims pass them on the sides or whatever. There's always times when Jewish communities were made to feel their inferiority. but never times when they were just massacred in large numbers or treated like absolute trash the way they were in the Christian world for most of it. It's much worse in the Christian world.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. So kind of moving forward a little bit, this kind of relates to the future and the past, which is modern day Jewish people. How are they able to stay together and from their perspective, like their DNA never got, they're directly connected, right? They're the same people. There's no intermingling. Is there truth to that? How are they, when they say like, oh yeah, that was us back then, we stayed together this whole time during the diaspora and all that. What was that migration like to the Jewish people today? Like how do they relate to the two ancient kingdoms?
Now, this is one place where genetic studies actually provide support to both sides, because you can actually find distinct haplogroups, distinct types within the genes for Jewish people that all do go back to the ancient Levant. You can find, for example, the priestly line present all over the place. Wherever Jewish communities have been, you can find the same genetic markers for them. So you do have a connection to that ancient Palestine among the Jewish people everywhere. But everywhere they've gone, they've always intermarried. This is why, like, Polish Jews can be blonde and blue-eyed, and the Iranian Jews look Persian or whatever. Moroccan Jews look North African. There are Chinese Jews, Ethiopian Jews. People are, all over the place, look like the people around them, because people do marry in and people do convert. Jews tend not to knock on your door and like, excuse me, sir, have you heard the truth of Moses or whatever, like Christians will. But people can always convert to Judaism, and people always have. It's been a continuous part of the history for thousands of years.
So there are people that aren't related at all to the bloodline that are today's, like, No,
they all are, because anybody who's married into it has married into a culture that does have those genetic markers. It's just it picks up others. So even if you're looking at people who look Chinese or look East African, they still have some of the same genetic markers that Jews anywhere else have and that people in the Levant have. So they are still all genetically related. You've just added other layers to it. In the same way that people in Palestine have later waves of migration from, like, okay, I mentioned the Peleset, the Philistines. You've got Greeks that have settled in there, Romans that have settled in there. Just tons and tons of peoples that have come in later as well and also blended in. But the basic layer in the DNA is still that same Canaanite DNA. It's literally the same thing. It's just that some of it happens in that region where people have come in and intermarried into it, and others happen with the populations scattered elsewhere, and they've mingled in with the populations that they're around. But they all carry those same Levantine genetic markers.
And those Levantine genetic markers, are those related to modern-day Palestinians as well?
Modern-day Palestinians have the same ones, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
A lot of modern-day Palestinians are literally descended from Jews. They're Jews who had adopted Christianity, who then either stayed Christian or adopted Islam.
Yeah.
They're literally originally the same people. And not just going back all the way to the Canaanite people when they were originally all the same population and Judaism diverged out of that, but like the population that was still there that had become Jewish. Not all of them left. It's a common misconception that all the different periods of diaspora mean all Jews leave. That never, ever, ever happened. It's one of the reasons that, like, the Exodus story itself is problematic. Yes, there's some later movement back in of some Semitic speakers that do pass in through the area, but most of the population was already present there. They never actually left. It's not like all the people were in Egypt and all the people came back.
Yeah.
It's just small admixtures of people. The core population has literally always been in the Levant. So a lot of Palestinians, and I'm not saying this to chap the hide of any Palestinian, but many of them are literally descended from Jews.
Yeah.
Who had become Christian and had stayed in that area.
Yeah, because it's the same people. It's literally the exact same people.
Exactly. Yeah. The population, the area has never been depopulated. It's not like anybody came along and just swept everybody into the garbage and sprinkled new people onto it from on high. No, it's The majority of the population has literally always been there.
And to give a simple answer, because we kind of go back, and by the way, hundreds of people have joined in, so they're newer. To that question, to a quick version of it, even though we've already kind of said it, when someone asks the question, who was there first, Palestinians or Jewish people or Arabs or
Neither of them. It's not true for either of them, and it's equally true for both. They're literally the same people originally.
It's like chicken.
I mean, if you go back, the modern Palestinian identity and the modern Jewish national identity are both products of the 19th century.
Yeah.
Neither of them have any relationship to ancient peoples. In terms of the political identity, what it means to be Palestinian, what it means to be Zionist or Jewish today in Israel, what it means to be Israeli, those are 19th century identities. But as far as the peoples on the ground, they've always been there, and they're both related to it, and they're both descended from exactly the same people who were neither Palestinian nor Jewish. Jews weren't there first. The Jews emerged out of people who were already there, and so did the ancestors of the Palestinians.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's what I kind of tell people. Again, it's kind of like where you want to start your history. You can frame it the way you want, because you can say, "Oh, right. Look, this is where Jews started. We were here." It's like, okay, but the people before you were there, so it's not a right. Jewish thing. It's a human thing. There were other humans.
Right. Exactly. It's the whole who got there first is just, it's ridiculous, because it all just involves selective reading of history. You're cherry picking the pieces that fit a particular national mythology that you want to use, and both Palestinians and Jews do the same thing. They both lie. But that's true of peoples literally anywhere. A lot of Iranians that talk about their people, their culture descending from the ancient Persian Empire, that's bullshit. That's a modern invention. Or Western Europeans saying that they descended from the Roman Empire, that's bullshit. They just made that shit up too. People invent a national story for themselves, drawing selectively certain elements from the past that they like. And then they leave out everything that doesn't fit. And then they pass that narrative on as if that's all there is. And most people never take the time to go beyond that, to really look at more of the information. In the same way that most people never actually study their religion. Tons of sincere believers of religion don't really understand where it came from, how it developed, because that's just normal. I mean, who has the time to do that shit? That's what specialists do. Most people don't go to seminary school.
Yeah, and to be fair, based on what we talked about earlier, where you see polytheistic gods play a role in the Torah, it kind of defeats the whole story, right? Studying it in depth starts to break it down.
Because again, it depends on what you're talking about or how you want to use it. Because there is a particular narrative, there's a particular mythos created for Judaism. And for Judaism, it has a specific story to it, in the same way that there's a specific story for Islam. But, a lot of the stories that are in Quran, I mean, people will point to that too, and they'll say this is literally true, and it's not. There's a whole lot of myth in there too. Same with the Christian story. Tons and tons of parts of the Christian narrative it's mythologized. This is true for all of them. Within the system, it's true and it makes sense. As soon as you step out of that and you start looking at it in terms of comparative histories, looking at the documentation for it, bringing in the archaeology and everything else, that's the only place where it gets complicated. And as soon as you do that, everyone's wrong. But that's true everywhere in the world. It doesn't matter if you're, Chinese or whatever. I mean, every national mythology is ultimately ahistorical, but that's not the point of them. No national story was ever intended to be factual. They can't be.
No, that's perfect. And then, Hibba, do you want to ask that last question you just texted me, and then we're going to jump to the mid 1800s and move from there.
Hi. So I'm keeping track of really nice to meet you. Thank you, Liam, so much for being here and taking the time to educate all of us. Genuinely, we all appreciate it. I did have one question from the comments. They're asking about the mosque, the Aqsa Mosque over the temple, or over the Second Temple, whether the Muslims destroyed it, whether the Muslims knew it was there when they built it, what came first, kind of situation. So if you can please go into that.
Yeah, okay, so short on this. there probably was some kind of temple complex there beforehand, in a kind of first temple period, but at that point you're not talking about a monotheistic period at all. A monotheistic temple is built in the Persian period that becomes the second temple. And that is the one that would probably be most familiar to people, the way they're thinking about, actual temple Judaism. And that gets later renovated, rebuilt a bit during Herod's period. And by that point, under Herod, is when you get the basic rectangular shape of it, where you've completely filled it. Originally there's a hill there, and that hill, there's walls around it, and they filled it all in and made this giant raised platform over it. So tons of the very low, big ass stones only go back to Herod's period, because the second temple beforehand, it was tiny. It was like a little itty bitty thing, because the people itself was never very rich. But as we get to Herod's day, it's they're throwing a whole lot of money, and they rebuild it and make this really nice system there. And then that's the one that the Romans destroy. And when the Romans destroy it, they burn it to the ground. There's no longer anything on top of this. And well into the Christian period, the way that they used it was as a trash dump. The Christians just basically threw their shit up on top of the Temple Mount, because it wasn't important to them. Jerusalem was also it was their holiest site, because of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and Jesus' death and burial and all that stuff. That's the important part of Jerusalem for them, not the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount is a reminder of this population that they've superseded theologically. So they literally used it as a refuge pit. When the Arabs got there, they were looking for the spot. They found it. It's this is important for us. They're the ones who cleaned it off. And they started using it as a mosque, because the Al-Aqsa story that's in Quran, they don't name it as Jerusalem because the word wasn't present for them, but this is the reason that the first direction of prayer was to the north. They knew they were connecting themselves to the larger Jewish tradition. So, I mean, in Islamic myth, you have Muhammad flying there in the night journey and, ascending to heaven and talk to the prophets or whatever. So it's a holy site for them as well. They clear that off, and in the Umayyad period, they construct a shrine at the center of it. So Al-Aqsa is the functioning mosque, and that's been rebuilt multiple times. The current one that's on there only goes back to the Ottoman period. That's on the southern edge of the Temple Mount, at the Haram al-Sharif. But in the dead center of it is the Dome of the Rock is the finest surviving example of Umayyad era architecture, and it's built over an exposed piece of bedrock, the original tip of the hill that they built in around. In Jewish tradition, this is where Abraham almost sacrificed Yitzhak or Isaac. And in Muslim tradition, this is where he almost sacrificed Ishmael. It's in Jewish tradition, basically the finger of God is always touching it. This is super holy site. And Muslims honor the same connection to Abraham because he's a first patriarch for them as well. Because Abraham's the father of Ishmael, who is symbolically the progenitor of the Arab peoples and their myth. So it's important to both, and this shrine it's basically a shrine to Abraham and to that near sacrifice that's on that site. But it's not a temple and it's not a mosque. So does that?
Yeah, perfect. No, genuinely, yeah, perfect. Thank you so much. I have one other question. This is kind of more opinion based, or maybe I just wonder what you think. As we know, there was 1,000, or no, I don't know what the number is, right? Dead Sea Scrolls that were faked. That were falsified, and we know it's in the National Geographic that they talked about it. Some found it was found to be falsified, the same way how there's also been falsifying of evidence by the Israeli government, putting architectural pieces underground, then going to go ahead and find them. So I'm curious what your opinion in this is, and whether it comes, whether the question comes to question the validity of all architectural evidence when Israel does have a history of falsifying things.
As far as I know, there's relatively little falsification on that side, but there is misidentification. And there is on the Israeli side a long history of deliberately falsifying place names, trying to pretend that this Palestinian site was actually this ancient Jewish community, but it wasn't. There's just bullshit for them there. But not a lot of deliberate attempts to kind of bury bits of the past. It's more a matter of how do you understand or interpret them, and oftentimes they're misreading some of the material that way. None of that stuff holds up very long because the scholars tear that shit apart very quickly. There are always fraudulent documents that are found, things that are purported to be like ancient scrolls or whatever. Dead Sea Scrolls, they actually are real. There were people who claimed to find other fragments of ancient texts. This is also true, like the Nag Hammadi library that was found. There's another huge cache of ancient documents, and people are like, oh, I found another one. Here's this one, and that one's bullshit. The fake ones are found out very, very quickly. The people who actually study this stuff, who actually work with the languages and the materials, they know what they're doing. So the fakes don't hold up. Generally, when people have a fake, they won't let scholars look at it. They're trying to keep it in private collections or auction it off, this or that. As soon as it actually gets touched by scholars, they find out. But there's a ton of ancient documents that we have that do go back in this period, a ton of the Dead Sea Scrolls that are actually real. Where some people have said some of the stuff is faked or whatever, it's largely just because elements of the text have changed over time. So some of the biblical books that surviving copies from Qumran have a few words different here and there from the later Masoretic texts that become the basis of the Hebrew Bible. So it sometimes there's variations there, and that's caused some people to say, well, this is fake. This is someone trying to cause problems, this or that or the other thing. But it's more a matter that all these texts were in flux everywhere. And there's tons and tons of variation in early Christian texts, early Jewish texts, et cetera, et cetera. It's much later that we get a locked-in text, a single one that doesn't change. It's a much longer process of development of the text than people tend to think.
Perfect.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay, now we're gonna. So what I want to do for the rest of the time, we're gonna do an hour-ish left, where I want to dive more into the modern, and then leave 30 minutes at the end where people can ask all sorts of questions, jumping back, forth, all different ways.
This is sort of a side point quickly, and this is true for really any part of anything that comes up here. So just as a general point for people too. But on the last one there about the development of texts and the different things that have been found archaeologically and in the different books there. If anyone's interested, I can recommend. We happen to be sitting in a part of my library that actually has a bunch of that stuff. If anyone's interested in some of the histories of how different Jewish and Christian texts developed, right? And questions about the parts that were forged and weren't forged, and which ones are authentic or not authentic. I have a ton of material on that because I'm fascinated by the evolution of these different traditions. So if anybody's curious, they can get contact information from me, and then I can recommend books. So just as a general point on any of these topics, but also related to that last question.
That's perfect, because I get a lot of people that anytime I talk about these subjects, they always go oh, do you have a book? Do you have a book? Do you have a book? And I was like, all right, yeah, we'll go over that for sure. So, so is there a book you can recommend right now that is an overarching book that people could start at who may not be one in depth, or are they all very in depth kind of books? What's the one?
And this is about the conflict specifically, not about the history of the Jewish Jewish literature, because that's what he was talking about. Dom, he's talking about
I'm saying Jewish literature. Yeah.
Oh, so they were asking two different questions.
Either, honestly, yeah.
Well, honestly, it's most things that I have tend to be specialist scholar works on certain parts of it, but there are a few that try to survey things from overall, I have a handful of simple archaeological surveys. I mean, the problem is whenever you do that, none of them are perfect because you're trying to cover a whole lot of material. So inevitably there's certain issues with it, but this is a decent survey of early Jewish archaeology. That'll be a good single one on the. Let me think for a second on a good one for the development of the text, because there's a lot on the development of Torah. You can probably start with very simple things this is a pretty simple one. Pretty basic. This one's written for a popular audience. Again, not perfect because of that, but a good start there. As far as the Israel-Palestine conflict, Honestly, most textbooky type books tend to be lousy, but some of them are better than others. So like Ilan Pape's Modern History of Palestine is pretty good as a
Yeah, that's
little
what
volume.
it's ordered. Yeah.
Look there at this. There's let's see. Let's see. These both go through the material so fast that they're leaving a whole lot out, but they're both like, intended as college textbooks for it.
What's the? Can you read the titles because it's back.
The Arab-Israeli conflict by David Lesh, and then Palestine and the Arab-Israeli conflict by Charles Smith. They're textbooks, and I tend to dislike textbooks, but they're a nice little synthetic overview of some of the basic issues there. But for more specific questions, if somebody's more interested in what is Israel's relation to the Arab states, or what is Israel's relation to the Palestinian people, or how have the Palestinians been affected by the Israelis or by the occupation or anything else, I can give much better books as suggestions there.
Yeah.
But none of them they're not trying to cover the entire thing.
Yeah, and we'll go over those as we now move forward, which is two things while we stop for a couple seconds here. One, we're at 700 people, so I want to say thank you to the live viewers for 700.
This is also pretty good. Rashid Holiday's 100 Years War on Palestine is also pretty good, overview.
Have you read Palestine Hijacked, Liam?
Palestine Hijacked. Who's the author? Doesn't sound familiar.
What's his name? Thomas Suarez, I believe.
No, it doesn't sound familiar. No.
Okay, it's a good read on the creation of Israel and Zionism as a whole.
Okay, so moving forward too. So first off, please guys, we want to show Liam love. So do all the gifts on the Liam, not on me, not on Caucasian Arab. Right now, we're going straight to Liam. So I need you guys to show love right now and blast it, hand hearts, everything you can do. I need you guys to throw it up. Make sure to like. We're at 231,000 likes. Let's get to 500,000 likes. We can do this. And we're going to go over everything again very lightly at the end, and we're going to do open Q&A, but I want you guys to show Liam love on what it's like to be on TikTok, so that way, because he will come back live. We'll do a ton more of these and do a lot of these. So a lot of you guys were asking, is this recorded or how do I get? He has a long version of this too on YouTube. If you want to look him up, just look up his name, and the link is in my bio actually. But also in general, we'll do more of these if these go well. If we can get to a certain amount of donations, don't give me anything. Give it all to him. I don't want it. But just throw it, blast it, show him what we can do. On top of that, we'll start moving forward to a little bit more modern, and then I guess at the end, like I said, whatever questions you guys have, we will have you guys come up, ask questions, or just do it in the chat might be easier, but we will answer random questions. Heba, you want to say something?
Yeah, I just want to say the way to tap the screen and to keep sharing, to keep liking the live is to tap Dominic's box up there in the corner. So just tap his box and that'll like the live. Share the live, even if you don't just with all the boost the algorithm, keep commenting. Commenting also helps get the word out to more people. So please continue, doing this. Thank you so much, Liam. Yeah, no,
my pleasure. I mean, I've been teaching this conflict for 15 years or so. I mean, it's this has always been an area of serious interest for me too. And I finally just decided to start. I started taking the course I wrote on this and started turning it into a book too. So, whoa, there's a lion on the screen. That got attention from one of my lions too. But yeah, I'm actually there's tons of good books on the ancient history and tons of good ones on the modern period. I'm trying to write something synthetically that kind of covers 4 millennia of history in the area, and actually will go through some of the stuff we started with today. So
perfect. Okay, so
now.
So moving forward as we kind of shift gears and kind of go more modern, I want to go, this is where most of us know, we've talked about this 100 different times, so we can go over this later on, but I don't want to just go over here's again how the whole Zionist started to move in. It'll naturally come through the questions that we ask or that I'm going to go over. So basically, if you want to give like very short kind of spiel about Theodore Herzl and that first kind of migration. There were a couple, I think 13,000 Jewish people living there in 1880. When did those actual migrations start? And I guess the first question is, when did Zionism start and what is Zionism?
Yeah, it's honestly always confused me that people start with Theodor Herzl, but on some level it doesn't, because Herzl creates political Zionism, and people tend to know more about political Zionism than practical Zionism. Political Zionism being the process of raising money and creating international organizations and lobbying governments and all that shit. That's what Herzl starts. Zionism predates him by many decades. The first significant book presenting a Zionist argument is out in 1862. Herzl doesn't become a Zionist until long after that part.
So I'm gonna run and grab something, but I have my other phone so I can hear you while you tell the audience. Then can you explain, because this is also something that's a big contention in this argument that we have with people is like, oh, Zionists are just people who want an Israeli state, but that's it. And then some people say, no, Zionists are like, oh my God, someone's playing a lot of you. Wow, that's amazing. Holy crap. Thank you for sending that gift to Liam. But people are, the argument we get is like, oh, well, some people want to take the full thing, even parts of Lebanon. So just generally, can you explain what Zionism is, and then what that difference is and how it shifts into Theodor Herzl, and then you can just start going off into there.
The cats are a gift? I don't know how. I keep seeing tons of pictures pop on here. I don't know how any of that stuff works. So.
Every single picture, anything you see on the screen that's not just words is money for you.
Whoa. Okay.
It's got like a weird conversion rating. Caucasian Arab knows it better than I do, but it's like, it's a factor of like 1,000 or something like that. You divide it by 1,000 or something, roughly. But yeah, so this is all money that's getting thrown to. But yeah, so give us a little bit about, or not even a little bit about, explain Zionism. Where did it start? What was it about? And then Theodor Herzl.
All right, so I'll try to keep this as brief as I can, because you're asking a huge question. Zionism is a form of European ethno-nationalism. In that way, it's as legitimate or illegitimate, depending on your philosophical position, as any other nationalist movement in Europe. So either whether you're talking about the creation of national identities in larger states like France, where you then have to go and, assimilate tons of people who speak different languages in the same territory, or whether you're talking about nationalist movements developing in larger multi-ethnic states like the Austro-Hungarian Empire or the Ottoman Empire or the Russian Empire, and trying to break away and create like a Bulgaria, a Poland, blah, blah, blah. Like, nationalisms are the idea that a nation deserves a state. Short here is a nation is a group of people. Americans constantly fuck this word up. A nation is not a country. A nation is a group of people with something in common. How you define that is up to the people inventing the nationalism. So it can involve language, it can involve religion, it can involve some kind of, ethnic or cultural features, it can involve a shared history, like whatever goes into that, but a group of people wanting a state, and specifically a state that represents the interests of their nation, which means that nationalisms are all ultimately a form of racism, because they're all about creating an in-group and an out-group. A nation state is a country for a particular group of people and not for anybody else. So Zionism is an ethnic nationalism, just like all these other ones in Europe, and it's aimed at creating a state distinctly for new Hebrews, a kind of like modern Jewish nationalism. Jews, before this point, they have in common like older Torah history, that kind of stuff, like some kind of shared traditions there, but they don't have a common national identity, because Moroccan Jews and Ethiopian Jews and Indian Jews live very different lives. They speak different languages. They have different histories. But you create a distinct national identity from the mid-19th century on that attempts to unify Jews into a single group of people. That has taken off by the time you get into the 1870s and 1880s. There's clubs springing up all over Eastern Europe. These Hovevit Zion clubs are places where people can go and they can study the revived Hebrew language, because Hebrew had died out as a spoken language about 2,500 years ago. But then, like, Jesus is walking around. People aren't speaking Hebrew anymore. They're speaking related languages still, but not Hebrew. But it's sort of a revived language. They kind of have to add to the grammar a bit, add vocabulary to it to make it a fully functional language. But with that, you can start producing new literature. And now you have a way for Spanish Jews and Russian Jews and Moroccan Jews to all have a common identity, like to link together. And people can start to move. The first waves of migration are way before Herzl. You've got people moving in there in the 1880s and 1890s, setting up small communities in Palestine, in Ottoman Palestine. And these early migrants, they don't know a damn bit about what they're getting themselves into. They didn't have enough money to study this or plan it. They just basically taught themselves Hebrew, saved up for tickets, hopped on a boat, and sailed over. And about 25,000, some of them moved, but many of the people who move in the first wave of migration, that first aliyah, they don't stay. They'll end up later buying a ticket to Buenos Aires or New York and getting the hell out because it's difficult to adapt here. But some of them do manage to blend in. They start learning from the Palestinians. Frequently, they'll build a community right next to an Arab community, and they'll settle in next to them, and they'll start learning agricultural techniques from them. Sometimes they'll purchase the land. They're like, okay, you're already here, cool. So just keep on farming. We'll find a way to work together. And they're just like trying to link up there. When Herzl shows up on the scene, you start to develop, there's an ideological shift, and they start planning much more explicitly to create a distinct ethnic state and to create completely separate communities, to like break people apart. I often walk people through this transformation here in Palestine from the teens, 20s, and 30s, because the later waves of migration that are following that ideology are starting to think about creating parallel societies, where before people would arrive, they're renting places from Arabs, they're buying stuff from Arabs, they're interacting in that community. They start thinking about trying to patronize only other Jewish businesses, building only a Jewish economy, completely separating themselves from it. And now when they purchase land, they tend to walk onto it and say, get the fuck out, and throw people off of it. But there still aren't that many of them. By the time the British Mandate period starts, so when they're on the ground, they started like figuring out everything. So like say around 1922, there's something like 80,000 Jews on the ground, but out of that 80,000, only 25,000 are Zionists from the first two waves of migration. So again, two different waves of migration by now, but a lot of people have left too. It's hard to make a living here. But so 25,000 out of the 80,000 are Zionists. So it's a pretty small chunk of people. It's in the 20s and 30s under Britain that the Zionist population takes off and more people are moving in, because it's advantageous to the British Empire to have a population that's a bit more Europeanized on the ground. It makes it easier to control the territory. So even though Britain is always intending, on paper at least, to create an Arab Palestine, they want a Jewish population to help them to kind of like, create modern institutions and blah, 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 like, make it a better functional long-term partner for the British Empire. They misunderstand just how aggressive the Zionist national identity is, though, and it really gets out of hand fast. By the time you get to the 1930s, the creation of an independent Jewish state is inevitable, and it was always going to involve chasing people out. The earlier proposed partitions always involve, and this is where like there's a lot of propagandistic narratives. Oh, like the Zionists agreed to take this tiny little state, and the Arabs said no. That's just straight up a lie, because we have their journals, we have their letters, we have all of their correspondence, we have speeches and meetings. The Zionist movement always intended to take whatever they could get and then conquer the rest. It was never not a question. So you look back at the little Peel partition plan that the British proposed and then took back, because even Britain realized as far back as the 1930s that it was impossible to divide this land. But when they proposed that little state, the Zionist movement accepted it, always intending to bring in a whole bunch of migrants and then conquer the whole rest of the land.
And this, so I think what'll be interesting here is there's one person that we had a debate with a couple of days ago over this. He wanted to come on and ask a question because he goes, "Oh, what he said was false." And I didn't want to bring up one person one time to do that so we can have a little discussion over it. But where I read a lot about this is Ben Gurion, right? So in his writings, he stated. This guest has already gone. He stated in his writings that, hey, we intend to take anything we can get. It was written in 1920, I believe, his interview, where he said, we intend to take anything we can get in the land given, but the greater vision of Zionism will not be stopped. And then he even mentions Transjordan, which is West Bank area. He basically states that is a part of our greater vision that no matter what you do, we want that. And so, can you?
Ben Gurion wanted southern Lebanon. I mean, and Ben Gurion originally talked about the East Bank of the Jordan too. I mean, so yeah, it was the original vision was much more expansive than it got to be later.
Okay, let me add her back on. And let's talk a little bit about that, which is Zionism in general. The early Zionists. What was it like from the 1910, which you kind of talked about this a little bit more, but into the 1930s, 40s, right before we get into 48, and we'll move forward from there. But in between that, we hear a lot of people saying, "Oh, there was the the massacre, right? The Arabs massacred the Jewish population," and that is what kind of stemmed them from going, "Look, you guys keep killing us from time to time again. This is why we are defensive. This is why we're just protecting ourselves. This is why we attacked." What was life like? And those squabbles during that time.
Well, again, what's happening with the new ideology that you've got developing post Herzl and post creation of the WZO is to create a complete parallel society and to cut the Arabs out, cut the Palestinians out entirely from that. And the goal from that point on is really aiming toward ethnic cleansing. And you can see that from the fact that when Zionists purchased land, they started throwing the Arabs off of it, which is how a lot of Arab cities became cities in the first place. These towns, the population starts swelling in them because people are thrown off their land. Where are they going to go? Where they end up in these different towns. And in those areas, the economy is not growing fast enough, so you have a large population of landless young men. Of course they're going to get angry and lash out. I mean, people literally threw them off their land. They're pissed. So yeah, if they can stab a settler, they'll stab a settler. Realistically, this shouldn't be viewed any differently from the way that Amerindians resisted the settlement of North America. When people walk in and then they steal your land and chase you off of it, of course you're going to take shots at them. I mean, we have, tons and tons of so-called Indian wars in the U.S. where these different, nations fought back, and they were all sovereign nations with distinct cultures and languages and traditions. And of course they fought back against people. So yes, Palestinians did stab Zionists, but they did so when Zionists started stealing land and throwing them off of it. There was a lot less of that early on when, especially in the time before and during the first Aliyah, when there was a lot more cooperative development, and there was always interesting tensions there. So if you're looking in the teens, 20s, 30s, there were a lot of people on the land on the ground that were aiming for a binational state at best, who didn't like the extreme Zionist vision and disagree with a lot of the Zionist leadership on that. There were tons and tons of socialists and communists who organized their labor groups and brought Arabs into it as well, and created binational labor unions to try and aid each other and develop the land together. So there was always a tension within the Zionist movement, and a significant chunk of people did not want the ethno-state that they got with Israel. They wanted something binational, something that looked nothing like what we have today. But the leadership, following on the more extreme ideology that comes out of the WZO, that's aiming for a Zionist ethno-state. And this is true on both right and left. It's one of the reasons that Ben Gurion's interesting to bring up here, because Ben Gurion, leading the Mapai party, economically he's a socialist, but he's also a nationalist. So he's walking a fine tightrope there. On the right side of that, the revisionist Zionist movement is overtly fascistic. So like Zev Jabotinsky's movement that formed out of like the Baitar militias from Eastern Europe, they toss all the socialist economics, but they keep the radical ethno-nationalism. Where secular right and left agree is on the nationalism. They both agreed that they want the entirety of the land to themselves, and they want to drive the Palestinians out of it. So you've got multiple factions. You've got a binational faction, and there's plenty of Palestinians at the time that were organized along these lines, as well as like, significant Zionist thinkers or like Jewish philosophers like Martin Buber calling for a binational solution. Then you've got the Zionist left that wants an ethno-state but with left-wing economics, and the Zionist right that wants an ethno-state with right-wing economics. The state itself is ultimately going to take shape largely along the latter two lines. In its early decades, it's led by the labor coalition, but because of they share that nationalism, it actually has a lot of the basic elements that you see in the Israeli far right that take power from 1977 on.
Well,
so it is laying a lot of you're seeing in the 20s and 30s a lot of the stuff that you'll see much later with like the Likud type parties here. It's already being done around the time of Ben Gurion.
So can you talk a little bit about, because people have this misconception, they said, when you were talking, they said, see, I told you, they bought the land from them. Did they buy the land? Did they steal the land? Was it a mixture? Can you talk about that?
Okay, so for purchases, the purchases that took place there, nearly all of them were from absentee landowners. And this goes back to the short of this, because it involves a little bit of discussion of the Ottoman state. The Ottomans begin reforming the way they manage property. Private property in land, which Americans take for granted, did not exist in the Ottoman Empire. Technically, all land belonged to the Sultan, but people had the right to use land. So, hey, no one's here. I'm going to build my house on this hill. I now own it. I own the house. I don't own the land under it, but I own the house, right? So it's mine as long as I want to use it. Or no one's using this field for their goats or for their orchard or whatever. I want to start using it. I now have permanent usufruct rights. It's now mine to use. But you didn't have a title deed for it. The Ottoman Empire in the mid-19th century starts passing land reform bills that create a concept of private property. When that happens, most of the Arab peasants, they don't understand the concept. So you start going out to these different fellahins like, hey, cool, so you live here. I'm here to take a little survey. I want to know, like, who all lives here? What do you own? Like, what land do you use? Blah, blah, blah. And at the end of it, I'm going to give you this title. The people hear this and they think this is a scam. They just want to draft my sons into the army. They want to tax me more. This is bullshit. So instead, land speculators gobbled it up. So they came in and said, like, just sign it over to me. I'll take it. They'll tax me instead of you. Don't worry. Nothing will happen to you. Palestine becomes economically immiserated largely because of this. It was much wealthier before. Instead, you end up with a small class of very rich people who own most of the land. And, once they start paying taxes, they're going to start charging rent to people who never had to pay anything for the land they lived on. So, of course, it's going to hurt them economically. But these absentee landowners, they never see it. They're not there. They live in Damascus, Istanbul. They have nothing to do with this at all. They just have the title deeds, and they're just raking in all this passive income as landlords. So the Zionists go to them, and they're like, hey, we're going to offer you 3 times the market value for that land. Will you sell it to us? I'm like, shit, yeah, I'll sell it to you. And then they go to the people there. Palestinians didn't sell land. Most Palestinians had no ability to sell land because they didn't own it. It was owned by a tiny landed elite in the cities, like these wealthy land speculators who got nearly all of it. The Palestinians who actually did purchase the land themselves, who actually did sign the Ottoman documents and got it, they didn't sell their land. We have almost no record of actual Palestinians selling their land. The land that was sold to the Zionists is almost entirely from absentee landowners who weren't present on the ground. And even so, by the time you get to the 1947-48 conflict that sees the creation of Israel, the Zionists own 6% of the country. They own almost none of the land. They own 6% of the land. So it's not a huge share of it, but they do have chunks here and there. But again, nearly all of it purchased from absentee landowners.
Got it. And what would you say to someone who said, well, yeah, I mean, we bought it outright. Like, we did nothing wrong. This is not a violent takeover or anything. We just simply went and bought the land from the owners. You're not the owner, and we own it now. So get out. Like, we're not doing anything wrong. What's kind of the view of that?
Well, that becomes an ethical question. I mean, for people who want to defend capitalist private property, then yeah, that's hard to argue against. I don't. So for me, I have an ethical problem with that. I have an ethical problem with land ownership in general, but that's a whole different kind of discussion than this. The problem here is in the way that they dealt with the population that lived there. So you might have a family that's lived in the same chunk of land for 300 years. Right, they've continuously used the same house, built in this, used it for, grazing their animals, running their orchards, whatever here. And then someone shows up and says, "Hi, I bought this land from some dude in Istanbul, and you need to get the fuck out." Yeah. There's a certain injustice to that, a kind of an ethical concern. But again, if you want to take the purely free market capitalist sort of view of land ownership, then yeah, that's technically not doing anything wrong. But of course, it's one of the problems I have with capitalism. So.
Yeah, here, I'm going to bring up Oriel. Oriel had this is kind of bringing us back, but I do like a point of contention. I don't want people to feel like, oh, no one's challenging any of these thoughts. Like, if they feel like that's going to make them, I'll bring up one person, but we'll do it for a short period of time because I want to continue. But I've talked with Oriel before and wanted to bring him on, so he's joining right now. Hey, man, what's going on?
Howdy.
Good. Yeah, so earlier you were saying what he was saying was patently false. Hold on. Oriel.
Right, yeah. So it was a liturgical language.
Just one second. For some reason, your audio's not working, Oriel. The audience can't hear you. Let me drop you. Come back up.
No, all he has to do is mute and unmute. He doesn't have to drop. Just mute and unmute.
All right, talk, and then give me a thumbs up if you guys can hear him. Talk. Let's see. Let's see. No, they can't. All right, let me drop you and then come back. There we go.
So it's different because I can hear him.
Yeah, I can hear him too. It's that sometimes it's weird for the audience. It glitches.
Gotcha.
All right, let's see if this time works. All right, try again.
How about now? You hear me?
All right, guys, give a thumbs up if you can hear Oriel, not me. If you can hear him. Yes. Okay, we're gonna go. Ask your question again, Oriel, so we can go into it.
It was more just in reference to the Hebrew language thing that you mentioned earlier on, and then I had a few other questions, but it definitely was in circulation. I mean, I did 19 years in yeshiva. We studied text all the way through every century. It just wasn't used socially. It was revived by Eliezer ben Yehuda, basically turned into the modern language we have now. But in terms of literature and Jewish learning, Hebrew was used all the way through.
Well, yeah, exactly. But and so was Aramaic too. But that Hebrew is not a viable spoken language. It doesn't have. It's missing too much of the basic vocabulary that you'd need to use it as a spoken language. So it's studied in the text, and even there, the language that's studied as biblical Hebrew doesn't even stand up on its own as a language. Just looking at it from the perspective of a linguist. It's sort of like. You can see layers of centuries of development in the language within the texts themselves. It's kind of like bouncing from, Chaucer to Shakespeare to hip hop lyrics and back, on the same page, because it's all the stories are kind of like compiled all together and they create a distinct whole. And we can study that liturgically. We can study that. I've studied biblical Hebrew too. So as a language, it works there for the study of those texts. But you couldn't learn a language out of that and actually use it on the streets and write newspapers or books in it. So modern Hebrew is actually a different language. They're not the same language.
What was that? Would you say it was brought back by around the time of Eliezer ben Yehuda or previous to that? Because I know in Safed they had a printing press where they.
Yeah, but continuing to produce materials in biblical Hebrew is different from actually being able to produce modern literature in it. So it's very specific to religious languages. You've got that for tons of them. There's a whole bunch of existing liturgical languages that aren't spoken by people, and many of which you would you would struggle to have them spoken, and their understanding them would have shifted and changed in a lot of ways too. You can see that in some ways it kind of parallels the development of like ecclesiastical Latin in the church. The ecclesiastical Latin used by the Catholic Church is not the same language as the language of Cicero. It's just not. If you study ecclesiastical Latin, you really can't read classical Latin. You're forced to kind of like learn a whole bunch of the differences, and it's kind of like the difference between modern Hebrew and that. Like there are significant differences between the two languages. The revival of Hebrew isn't one person's project, but he does play a significant part in it. It's a general project throughout the Haskalah to kind of like start building something for a common identity, to start building something that you can work with. So there's some influence of like Slavic and Germanic grammars. There's a whole bunch of loan words that get brought into it. And that kind of makes it possible to engage in just normal street conversations in it and write new books. But for religious purposes, it continued to be used in the same way that Talmudic Aramaic was still used. But Talmudic Aramaic also couldn't be used as a spoken language.
Talmudic Aramaic is very different. If you look at the writings of the Ramban, or I'm trying to think of the English names for these authors, or the Rambam in general. I know Rambam wrote mostly in Arabic, but the Hebrew that they wrote in wasn't really Aramaic. It was much closer to the Hebrew that we speak today. I'd say, I don't know, from a linguistic perspective, I'm a Hebrew speaker. My first language, I grew up learning Hebrew text, ancient Hebrew text. It's about 60 to 70% similar. Obviously, that's not an exact number. I'm speaking for... But it's very different. It's not Aramaic Hebrew, and it's not Yiddish.
Aramaic's a different language entirely.
Right.
Aramaic's a related language, but it's an entirely different language. Yeah. But I'm using as a parallel, Talmud is written in Aramaic. Mm-hmm. So people could continue to read Aramaic. They study, Aramaic and Kollel and Yeshiva, but Aramaic couldn't be used in that form on the streets. Like the Aramaic spoken in villages that long after that is a completely different language. The languages could keep evolving beyond a certain point, but we lock in certain languages as scriptural languages, and we use them in those forms and in those contexts, but they cease to be a spoken language. They lose some of the vitality. Yeah, there's a lot of overlap between modern Hebrew and biblical Hebrew, but so is there between Middle English and modern English. But you would still struggle to read a bunch of Middle English texts. It's still involved in a learning curve.
And I'm just asking, so from a linguistic perspective, would if there was a time period between Middle English and Modern English and there might have been it was completely not used in public forum, would that consider it a dead language?
I'm not.
You
mean if English had died out completely? Okay, so English doesn't work here because English never dies out as a spoken language.
Right.
Hebrew dies out as a spoken language and is replaced by Aramaic at some point. There's not a lot of places where languages have been outright revived. So it is honestly kind of remarkable. But while modern Hebrew is based in biblical Hebrew, it is a revived language, which means it does have a lot of elements that aren't like biblical Hebrew too. So there are at least differences. But if you know one, it's pretty easy to learn the other. Just like it's relatively easy for English speakers to study other Germanic languages or earlier forms of English. But no modern English speaker is going to just straight up understand Old English. It would still take a bit of study.
And I had a question regarding, and this is more of a question. Anyone who tagged me, I'm not trying to come at it. In a debate sense, I want to bring certain points up, see what you have to say about them. So the first one, Dom touched on it, where he asked about the land purchases. And this actually relates to the debate we had previously, where we're talking about violence in the late 1800s, early 1900s between Arabs and Jews. And he mentioned, I think this is similar to what you're saying, that it was in response to Jews basically displacing Arabs in places of employment, and it was more of that anger that they had towards them that resulted in them occasionally stabbing people, which to me seems a little bit of a callous way to look at it. But
I'm not making a value judgment per se. I'm just pointing out that there is anger around it, and people lash out.
So
I'm not going to justify violence on anybody's side, but we can at least try to understand what causes it.
right. So my question was, if I were to ask a question, what scale was that at? Because based on what I read, and I'm going to send down the citations, I guess, to send to you, or if I could send directly, there were about 660 displaced Arab landowners at the time, and about 350 of them, around half of them, were basically given new land to work and moved somewhere else. So even if all of them had lost their land, how much did that affect the overall population? They're considering it was in the tens of thousands. It's not
depends entirely upon the year and places you're talking about. If you're talking about late 19th century, you're really still looking during the first Aliyah, which is where the Zionists are essentially creating a plantation economy. They're not full on displacing people. That's a 20th century development. You don't start seeing that until well into the 20th. So late in the aughts into the teens, that process begins, and it accelerates only in the 1920s. So in the 19th century, there's relatively little outright displacement, and hence there's relatively little violence. The violence starts picking up massively in the 20s and 30s because the displacements start picking up.
I think he's trying to say in the 20s, are you trying to say, Oriel, in the 20s there was only like 200 Arabs displaced?
At the time, we're talking in terms of landowners, because we touched on the buying land from absentee landlords, and I was reading up on it basically about the government had a program where they would place you in a different area, give you land if you were displaced by your landlord essentially selling out the land from under you. They got, according to this report, a year of notice, and within that year there was a lot of applications that came through, but the government rejected most of them. They weren't actual landless Arabs. They gave about 620 of them or 650 of them the ability to pick up, choose another area, or they would place them in another area. And of that 650, I think only 300 something accepted. So the numbers aren't that high relative to the people that you would say are attacking. And also a lot of the attacks happen in areas where I wouldn't imagine, you could correct me on this, the same people would reside, because you see it happen in Hebron, Jerusalem, areas that are where these farms were at, where these farmers would live. Like, you could tell me maybe they worked the land, but does my question, do you understand what I'm asking?
Not really, because I'm still not even clear on the time period you're talking about.
I think he's talking strictly about like that massacre and like why did they massacre if very little people were displaced, if they got land somewhere else, that their life wasn't like that, like, there wasn't disruption much at all.
In 1920s, it says officially it's referring to 1922. I think that's when the first report was, but.
Oh, okay. So yeah, you're already into the mandate period.
Yeah.
Right.
You're right. I'm sorry.
Okay, so because during that period too, you don't have programs to keep people new land either. The British simply didn't do that shit at all. Like some of the Ottomans tried to like move some people around and try to do some work there, but they were kind of constrained by what they could do, well, just financially. And a lot of people were always kind of unhappy about being moved from place to place. One, I guess, by analogy, you could look at the way that, large chunks of the Amerindian populations were moved from their ancestral lands and given other lands. But we're still pretty unhappy about that, being moved to different land, or like a restricted portion of the land so that some of it can be turned over to settlers. So you do have anger about that sort of thing. And that can be driven by not just the economic issue, but by a simple question of justice for a lot of people. I just hit on this today because it was an anniversary of something related to like the Dakota War. But the eastern bands of the Sioux, the Dakotas, not the Lakota, they had been moved to reservation lands, and more of their land had been kind of like, they've been pushed off from it, and they just lashed out in anger and ended up killing hundreds of settlers on lands that used to be theirs but weren't anymore.
Right.
Some of the attacks that you see in mandatory Palestine follow a very similar pattern, where people are angry about being displaced from places where they used to be, or angry about different people that are in there. So yeah, they're lashing out violently and in some of the same basic ways.
So I guess what I'm saying is, because Dom and I had this discussion, and the main point was, first of all, what I was asking in so many words was, how much carryover was there from the people who were displaced to the people who were actually carrying out the attacks? Because we see the numbers essentially in the 600s relative to the tens of thousands of people who were there at the time. And then also, the attacks we see weren't just on settlers, because when they did go out carry out attacks, for example, Hebron was one we touched on. That's one that a lot of people know about. They were partisans who were native to the area.
That's there's honestly it gets to some of the May Day riots and the Western Wall riots. We kind of like bookending the 20s. So like, one event in 22 around the May Day. So it's around the time of the event you're talking about. And then by the time you get to the end of the 20s in 1929 with the Western Wall riots, most of the victims are actually, they're Arab Jews. They're religious Jews. They have nothing to do with Zionism at all. And what that reflects is the same kind of basic conflation that a lot of people here have, where Jew and Zionist, just like Arab and Palestinian, get kind of like squished together, and you kind of like lose some of the specificity. So when sometimes like local religious Jews ended up getting killed because of what Zionists were doing somewhere entirely different. And it's actually a continuing problem. And I've had a lot of conversations with people in Palestine about this that are just talking about the Jews. I'm like, look, Jews, your problem is not with Jews. Your problem is with this specific political faction, in this country. It has nothing to do with, it has nothing to do with Jews in Brooklyn or like religious Jews or Arab Jews, or it had nothing to do with it.
Right.
But they still get killed.
What does that indicate? Because you connected it basically to the riots and the conflict they had surrounding the Western Wall, and I know around the Hebron massacre, there was talks about the Jews trying to take the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Wouldn't that indicate that it was more religiously motivated than motivated by the land grab? I'm sure people could say, it was both of those things combined, but we see...
Well, there's no religious reason... There's no religious reason for Muslims to attack Jews. It simply doesn't exist as an issue. For them, it's.
But is that historically accurate? I mean, you're the historian.
It is. Again, yeah, it is.
Well, I think too, Professor, I think, and this is what
there's a lot of places. I mean, I could give you readings on like the history of like the Jews in the Muslim world. I mean, there's a lot of great texts on this and the ways that people live together. The actual Arab Jews, no one had a problem with them for centuries in the area. They lived.
I mean, there were massacres. There were massacres throughout the 1800s, 1600s, 1500s in that specific area. Then as you expand to Morocco, Baghdad, Yemen, Algeria, you see that those things were continuous. And what I find is that it's constantly being downplayed when I get on these lives and speak to people where they're like, that was just once in a while. But you're not talking about small-scale gang wars. You're talking about people going into Jewish villages and ghettos and literally killing similar to what Jews are claiming happened on October 7th in those Kfalim. It's almost like they corroborated stories across the world. The Jews from Fez, Morocco went and said they're cutting off women's breasts and raping women. And then Jews from Baghdad are saying, they did the same thing to us. And I could cite instances.
Again, there's a difference between talking about religious issues or theological points and then people being dicks to each other, because human beings have a long history of being dickish to anybody different from them. Yeah, I have a lot of studies of Jewish communities that were treated like shit in different parts of the Muslim world. So if somebody wants readings on the history of Jews in Iraq or Jews in Morocco or whatever, yeah, there's plenty of times in which Jews were treated like shit and massacred. But human beings have a tendency to lash out at people who are different from them.
So could I ask, wasn't the Mufti the one sparking a lot of, pushing the people to carry out a lot of these riots and sort of ignite that fire?
You're jumping topics there. So that asshole, yes, but that again, there's a nationalist reason, and he's misusing his religion in it. And I actually use quotes from him talking about how Arabs should go and kill Jews wherever they find them. That guy was a complete prick, and ended up going on to record propaganda for the Nazis during World War II. A complete scumbag piece of shit.
I mean,
but again, human beings have a tendency to be awful to people who are different from them, and minorities living in anywhere in the world are often treated like shit. Comparatively, attacks by Muslims on Jews are not as frequent as attacks by Christians on Jews in areas where Christians are majority or Muslims are a majority, but they have always happened. They do exist. There's an extensive history of that. But again, you've got attacks on minorities literally everywhere. It doesn't matter what culture you're looking at, you're always going to find issues like that. What the problem is people sometimes conflate these issues and connect that history of violence to what's happening in the Zionist-Palestinian conflict. Right. And that's a very different situation. You have two things in the modern world that dramatically increase the levels of hatred of Jews in the Muslim world and the Arab world specifically. The French colonization in Algeria and the Zionist movement into Palestine. In both cases, it causes a significant splits, and the local Jews begin to be associated with the settlers. So Algerian Jews began to be associated with French colonists. And then once that had happened, the idea spreads around the Jews anywhere are always going to side with the Europeans, and therefore they can't be trusted, and people start stabbing Jews all over the place. And the same process happens in Palestine. And it's really unfortunate because there's a significant strain of anti-Semitism in the Arab world today that you can see in tons of Arab countries. You can see among Palestinians. Hamas is certainly guilty of this. And they are literally borrowing European anti-Semitic and anti-Judaic tropes, shit out of the Middle Ages, and recycling it for repurposing it for Arabs. And it's a horrific racist thing, but it's driven by the modern phenomena. It's not something that you would have seen. The blood libel didn't exist in 15th century Egypt. It does today in 21st century Egypt. It's imported later because people find other reasons to suddenly lash out at Jews.
So again, I find that there's constantly this disconnect. It seems like you're sort of disconnecting the religion for it and making it more of a them lashing out at the minority issue. But let's take Morocco, for example, because we brought it up, and I'm Moroccan personally. I have firsthand accounts, not firsthand, my grandfather's parents, from both sides of the family. In Fez, for years, Jews lived in the ghetto, and that was religiously motivated by their dhimmi status.
Not religiously motivated. The dhimmi status is, the ghetto part is not.
How is that not religiously motivated? If they're relegated to dhimmi status, they're not allowed to have houses taller than Muslim houses, and they're not allowed to have synagogues taller than the mosque. And when the dhimmi status was the regulations were softened, they were allowed to wear shoes outside the ghetto, which they weren't allowed to do previous to that. There was constant murders taking place in Fez. I think something like 300 murders in a 10-year period. And this is well before Zionism started becoming a thing.
Right, but again, but it is not before there are distinct identities that are separate in the area. When people have a religion, it doesn't mean that the idea comes from a religion. It's a common mistake people will make. People will justify killing other people using a religion all the frickin' time. But that doesn't actually mean it comes out of text and a religion. Dhimmi status does, the social inferiority does, so you could interpret from that things about the house sizes and the inferiority and the shoes and the rest of that shit. Squishing people into a ghetto or killing them are very different issues. Killing them based on being Jewish is literally forbidden in the Quran. But it doesn't mean people didn't do it. It doesn't mean that there weren't tons and tons of asshole Muslims who did this shit. So Muslims have done it, but the texts in Islam actually say not to do it. It's a common place where we conflate issues. For anybody who's interested in this kind of issue, I think one of the better books about the Moroccan issue is this is based in Marrakesh, not Fes, but the Mela of Marrakesh is a great book that goes through the status of Jews and just how often they were persecuted in the area, just how much discrimination there was towards them. Anywhere you're going to see a majority culture and a small minority in an area, you'll often see discriminatory practices develop over time, and they can tend to be really, really fucked up.
Right. So it seems like what you're saying is that it's not based in text, but it does seem to be based in, and it's not. And I see this. Yeah. I grew up an Orthodox Jew. A lot of things aren't based in text, and there are people that later on pervert it. But it is the current state of the religion that.
Right. Well, the religion as practiced by a particular people in a particular place, yes, absolutely. In the same way that like I don't know, the assholes in ISIS, Daesh, whatever you want to call them, that they're practicing a form of their religion, so they're Muslims, but they're doing things that directly contradict the Quran as well. So you could also make a case that they're being shitty Muslims, but it doesn't mean that they're not Muslim. They're absolutely Muslim, and they're using their religion to justify what they do.
Right. So in a practical sense, if you're a Jew living through that time, and maybe the people you could look at the people carrying out these attacks and the people being yelled to by their imam or their mufti, telling them, oh, they're trying to do this to you, trying to do that to you, and they have to be relegated to second-class status. And that guy's just being a dick. He's not being true to the text, and he's a bad guy. But as a Jew in that time, they were getting attacked under that premise.
Of course. Yeah. Of course, which means, again, the subjective experience is always going to be there for people. And you're always going to have this problem of how you want to understand these different groups. So, yeah, Muslims doing genuinely fucked up things, they're still Muslim, but they're bad Muslims. They're arguably bad Muslims. Right. And these different national governments, like when the Moroccan government is going after Jews, when the Mamluk government's going after Jews, when different governments are putting certain restrictions on them, they're all being fucked up, and they're all being affected by the social circumstance that they're in. And there is a similarity on a personal level. So I totally get that. Where it's difficult for me is that I have to draw certain specifications just because of the way I have to look at it. To understand the causal relations. Why are certain things happening? How are they distinct? Because if we take every act of violence against a Jew anywhere in the world, you can't give them all the same motive. They don't all have the same context. But they do have in common that a Jew was attacked. So on the personal subjective level, it doesn't make any difference. Somebody is still killing you. You obviously still face discrimination. But there are still different causes.
But again, they do share a common motive, and people in the chat are getting frustrated. They want to go back to the history. I want to be fair, but the reason
I get that too. But again,
I bring this up.
I will just argue that the motives actually are distinct, and they vary tremendously over time and place. The motives, even among different pre-modern Islamic states, are wildly different from one another. But the action ends up feeling the same. The target is the same, but the motives actually are different. But that would be a much bigger conversation, and we should get back to the other topic.
The reason I brought it up is because it sort of gives pretext to what brought the Sephardic Jews, who make up majorities of the Jews in Israel, to the land, and what motivated to come there. Obviously, there was a lot of expulsion after the fact, but I think removing that context from history, the fact that there were massacres against Jews in that land of Israel between the Arabs that were there, whether it was in Safed or Hebron, and throughout the Muslim world, all through that time. And they were motivated, you could say the actual case of the day, in one country they said, oh, the Jews are trying to take over the government. In the other country they said the Jews are siding with the invading army. But the idea that Jews were second-class citizens, and that is supported by Islam, is a prevalent thought process throughout, is it not?
I'm not sure I caught where you were going with that, honestly.
So I'm saying there is a common thought process throughout these countries, wherever it is, though the actual instance in which the attacks happened may be different. Say in one country, Jews got attacked because they believed that the Jews as a minority were siding with an invading government. And in another country, they believed the Jews were just trying to take over. Whatever the exact reason may be, the overarching reason they were comfortable attacking Jews and they believed in attacking Jews was tied to the idea that Jews were second-class citizens and reserved to dhimmi status, and were not.
That they were a minority. Yeah, exactly. That was true for any non-Muslim populations. So that, in that sense, yes, because these are religious states. In the same way that all the Christian powers were religious states. So obviously Jews were were not citizens there either. I mean, it was even worse there because they weren't citizens at all. But yeah, sir, second-class citizens for sure. They had more rights in the Muslim world than they had in Europe, but they definitely did not have all the same protections socially that Muslims did, which meant that discriminatory practices did happen. So that part it is in common. That's not true for the Palestine issue because dhimmi status is simply not present. The Ottoman Empire in the 19th century had already granted full legal equality to all peoples. There was no legal discrimination against Jews at all. From the time the Zionists first arrived on the land, Jews had full legal equality with Muslims.
Right.
Dhimmi status no longer existed.
In that same vein, we see that Jews in the Ottoman Empire were still attacked and were still massacred in certain instances by their Muslim neighbors. And a lot of these attacks, if you look at the text, and I sent Dominic some citations for this, were motivated. Whatever the overarching idea was, say they thought the Jews were siding with the government or it was just civil unrest, they attacked the Jewish community a lot of times, chanting, what's the word I'm looking for? They're using sort of religious motivations, whether it was a religious leader telling them to go get the Jews, quote unquote, or just saying the Jews are dogs, we're going to get sort of.
But Oriel, you answered your own question. You answered your own question by stating if they were siding with the opposing government, like that was the core of the issue. Now, how they used it to rally the people to attack is a completely different thing. But they're in.
And what I think he's missing too is that in that same context, you also had attacks on Druze, attacks on Alevis, attacks on Maronite Christians. There's fighting between the different communities in the area all throughout, and that starts to accelerate in the 19th and 20th century because of the influence of European nationalisms, nationalist discourses, and the social disruption of colonialism. But attacks on different minority communities and between different minority communities were pretty commonplace. So if we're going to see like an attack, some Sunnis attacking some Jews, we also have to look at like Druze fighting Maronites. We have tons of different communities butting heads in this region. And so it becomes intellectually dishonest to draw a certain lens onto one group of people and to then connect it to this overarching narrative when there are different causal factors here that are being left out.
And that's something that I wanted to address, which is, and this is why I brought him up, because I think this is a good point. A lot of people would think we're getting deterred. The reason why I'm bringing this up is this is a theme that we notice when I'm doing debates and things is like, no, look, the only reason that we're doing what we're doing is because Jews specifically are a unique group that only gets attacked and not many other people get attacked the same way we do. And what I was trying to talk with Oriel about last time is this is common among everyone. This happens every time among everyone. It is not only Jews get attacked and they're the only ones that are should receive pity or that there's something happening to them only. This is common among everyone. And Oriel, you answered your own question by saying, okay, well, yeah, maybe they attacked because they were opposing, siding with the opposing government, but they used this type of term. Yeah, those things happen. As a therapist myself, I'll tell you that psychologically, if you don't like someone for a real reason, you might use a stupid reason to rally more people, but that's not the initial cause of the attack. And that's what's important.
To give a nice close to the topic, so we can get back to your broader one, because the people in chat, you're right. We have been sidetracked here. There is one way I can kind of split the difference between you on this, because one thing about the Jewish community that is distinct is it is spread over a very wide area and was essentially surviving entirely as a minority in tons of different social contexts. So tons of different people from China to South Asia to West Africa have encountered Jews and have fought against Jews. So there is something within the Jewish collective memory that can see all of this hate there. But the causative factor is that Jews were scattered around as small minorities in different areas and often fell prey to the same kind of dynamic you see in tons of other minority groups. So yes, you can see something, the same dynamic that you're talking about, Dominic, that you can see playing out in tons of other peoples elsewhere, is kind of amplified in the Jewish history because of the specific circumstances of Jewish history and the fact that they are widely scattered. So
being a minority.
In a sense, you're kind of both right, but it depends on how you want to look at this.
To Dominic's point, first off, the Druze and the other infighting that you see between the sects, in a lot of cases, it was a two-way fight. And I actually asked him a few weeks ago to cite, and maybe you could bring me examples of the Jews, of the fighting going the other way, where the fighting was caused by Jews going into...
Oh, because like in the examples that you brought up earlier in the 1920s, there's a shit ton of them.
Right. Once it started, and there were shit starters like Abe Stern and the Stern Gang and Nirgun and all those people. But prior to that, and
long before that, I mean, you've already got violence caused by Zionists going back into the 1880s. I mean, they start picking fights too.
All right.
Before that, there's a lot less of that. But that's also true. I mean, tons of the different minority groups in the Middle East and as well as anywhere else in the world, it wasn't always a two-way fight. Sometimes it was just people being shit on. The Druze were generally being shit on, for ages. Tons of small minorities were, because they, people didn't like them. They viewed them as sort of like a cultural threat. So anyway, so let's kind of like move the conversation back, though.
Yeah, we'll shift. Hey, Oriel, thank you for hopping up. I appreciate it.
But yeah, no, this is fun. I wouldn't mind like this as a specific type of conversation. If you want to talk about Jewish history in the world, that could be a whole different discussion there.
Yeah, no, perfect. Thank you, buddy.
Take care.
And then the reason why I brought this up, because I knew we were going to get sidetracked, but I like it, which is it's a common theme that we hear, and that it gets placed on Muslim people, Arab people, especially me. I'm atheist, but I'll be like, oh, you're Arab, you're Muslim, you're Palestinian, you're Muslim. So I get this argument towards me of like, you guys have always been attacking Jews for so long, and this is kind of the underlying response from so many people, especially a lot of Zionists who go, you guys have been attacking us, you guys are just bad people, you guys just keep going at us. And I wanted to kind of have him bring that up, because that's like,
and it seems particularly strange in like an American or European context, with just the horrific history of Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant Christianity vis-a-vis the Jews. I mean, it's miles away worse, and somehow Christians will only, or Christians they're only pointing to like the history of like Muslims attacking them, when this happens markedly less often than Christians slaughtering Jews. So a lot of it ends up being culturally and politically motivated. A lot of the Christian world today, because of Christian Zionism, is pretty happy with the state of Israel, so it doesn't have the same kind of like overt discrimination there, even though the theological basis for that is actually genocidal. I mean, Christian Zionism is a genuinely genocidal ideology that just really...
They want them to go there. They want them to go there to die.
Well, yeah, they want them to go there, so they'll eventually, they'll pick a fight with the Muslims by destroying the Dome of the Rock. They'll rebuild a temple, and then because there's a temple there, boom, then the apocalypse can happen at the plains of Megiddo and all that, and then, nearly all the Jews can get wiped out, and then, the last of them convert, and then Jesus comes back, and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, it's a horrifying ideology. So a lot of Christian support for Israel is really dishonestly motivated.
And is that not true too? This is something I was studying recently for the ultra-Orthodox Jews who you see out there protesting. But the only reason they're protesting is because they believe that like their version of it is that like God has to come give it to them, not they take it.
Okay, so if you're referring specifically like groups like Neturei Katai, then for that traditional Haredi view is that, I mean, it's still there still is a kind of like, it is still problematic in its own way theologically. And for them, Hamashiach will come, and then there'll be a great war, they'll retake the land, blah, blah, blah. And that's fine. But it's their problem is with the secular state, and they view the secular state as a kind of blasphemy.
Yeah, and the reason I bring it up is just because I see so many people, they don't understand the context of the support for Israel. They all have their own unique reasons for it that aren't just, autonomy and sovereignty. It's usually...
Exactly. Support for Israel, just like plenty of attacks on Israel, have really problematic theological positions.
Yeah, of course. And that's something I want to touch. So one thing, this is kind of leading us into the next thing, which is, and what Oriel and I were debating was, again, this is where I just bring up questions and it can dive naturally into the history of it, which is, The Palestinians were offered all of these deals, and they've turned them down so many different times. And this is what me and Oriel were talking about. He goes, we gave you guys so many offers, you guys turned it down. What's the truth to that? When was the first quote unquote deal offered? What did the land look like at the time when the first deal was, and who offered that deal?
There weren't any. Like, there've literally been none. At no point have Palestinians ever been offered a state. Like, well, not like a sovereign state. It's never happened. I mean,
what are they offered?
Okay, so go back to like the British partition proposals, the Peel partition plans. They went through several versions, possible maps, talked about it. They talked to representatives of the communities, although there was no real representative institutions for Palestinians, so they couldn't talk to many people. But still, they talked to some of the exiled leaders and whatever. But there was no actual offer because A, the British didn't actually offer it. They took the deal back and said, this doesn't work. We can't find a way to make this work. And B, the Zionist position was, we'll conquer the rest of it. The partition plan under the UN, that wasn't an actual deal there because the Arab state they were talking about was likely to just going to be part of Jordan. There was no actual talk of like a Palestinian state in that territory. But it was basically carving out some of the land to create a distinct Jewish state. But again, the Zionist movement accepted it, fully intent on conquering all of it. You can see that in like Ben Gurion's statements like the Biltmore Conference in 1944. We're going to conquer 100% of this. By 1946 in Paris, he'd said, well, maybe we'll only take 90%. But in the actual fight in 47 to 48 on the ground, they were intending to take all of it. In fact, there was discussion of going all the way up to the Litani River in Lebanon and taking every bit of mandatory Palestine. And the only thing that really stopped that was that the war was dragging on and they worried about losing international support. And then they'd made the deal already kind of like through back channels, even before the fighting started with the leader in Transjordan. So like they had their deal already with Abdullah to kind of like, well, we'll turn some land over to you. The Zionist right opposed that. But the left was like, well, we'll take what we can get and at least stop there. But they still took much more than was offered by the UN. It was all about a division. Then why, from like 1947 on, 7 months before the British left, the Zionists were already shooting people and beginning the process of ethnic cleansing. They were intent on taking much, much more than the UN had offered. But even there, it was not an offer to a Palestinian state at all.
It was,
and then all the later negotiations too, you think about the Oslo deals. Oslo was never about a sovereign state at any point. The deal offered by Ehud Barak at Camp David, that was for a demilitarized, essentially colony that would have no control over its airspace or borders, could never have an army. It was not actually going to be a sovereign state. And even there, it wasn't actually offered to Arafat. So the whole bit about Arafat turned it down is straight out a lie, because Barak was told before this had even gotten going that he couldn't actually offer it, that his own government knew it couldn't get it through, that the Knesset would simply reject it. So Israel had no intention of doing this. His own government told him, you can't actually do this. So it was all just political theater. All of these things either are somehow completely false, like the British one, there was no actual offer, or the UN one, there was no actual offer, or the ones where they're negotiating with the Israelis, and at no point have the Israelis actually ever negotiated with the intent of creating another sovereign state between the Jordan and the Mediterranean. At no point has any Israeli government ever intended to do that. And they've been very clear about that. It's just the propaganda for foreign consumption lies about it. So if you actually look at Israeli sources, if you look at government statements, at their speeches, at the records in the Knesset, if you look at what they're saying in their press, they know they never actually offered this shit. But that lie is repeated constantly in the American media.
No, I appreciate that. But real quick, guys, remember to tap. We're almost at 400,000 likes. Make sure to donate. Wow. I want you to throw everything at Liam right now. Everything you can. I want you to throw it at him. Hiba, do you want to actually, you kind of texted me, but if you have a question, you can unmute and ask. But relating to those deals, when it came to 1948, when you say it wasn't even a deal, you just mean they just forced it on them.
Well, Which one do you mean? Who forced what on what?
Like people kind of so there's a lot of, I mean, obviously we're not talking to very many people who are educated in the sense of like this is their life, so they're not going to know, but a lot of people believe like, well, wasn't 1948 like an offer? They split it and then the Arabs told them no, and then that's why Israel
they're
not going to attack.
Well, they had no choice in that whatsoever. The UN discussions as they came up, the Arab position was, we would like a longer period of negotiation to try and come up with some kind of workable compromise here, because we're not really comfortable with what you're telling us you want to do. The idea of a division and the creation of a Palestinian state, it's not like they even said no outright to it. They said, we want to talk about this for a while long, and they just got steamrolled. This was, the situation was forced at the diplomatic level at the UN and the halls of power at a number of like major states. But it was also forced on the ground, and months before the British left. I mean, while British troops are still all over the country, they're just standing there twiddling their thumbs while Zionists are shooting people and driving them out of their homes. Because, you know, they knew they'd already screwed up. They'd try to give up, and they didn't want to get involved in a fight that would cost them more money and lives. So they just stood aside. But so the situation was just forced on the Palestinians, both on the ground and outside. It was never actually a negotiation and an offer. No one actually sat down and said, hey, let's talk about this. Let's work something out. They weren't even in the room.
Yeah, and that was a common theme, like in the Camp David Accords and before, where Palestinians never really had, I mean, they weren't recognized by Israel as a people. Was that not a tactic used for a while for them to not negotiate directly with, like, hey, these are just Egyptians that are just, you know, have wandered too far? What was that theme like from the Israeli side to Palestinians? Did they just ignore them? What was that relation?
The Israelis didn't actually acknowledge Palestinians as a people until the 1990s. And then at that point, they finally recognized that the PLO is a representative of a Palestinian people, but they still didn't recognize a Palestinian state. I mean, a Palestinian state had been declared earlier in the 80s. They still have never recognized that. So they never really recognized a kind of government in exile that they could negotiate with. They always only talked about representatives of the people. And again, at no point in the Oslo process was there ever discussion of Palestine as a country, ever. The goal from the Israeli side was always to create a kind of autonomy for people, a kind of like second-class status where you can devolve certain basic services. These different Palestinian institutions are going to pick up the trash and hook up the water and, like, you know, take care of people and do the policing, and we won't have to do it. But they won't actually be sovereign. They won't really control the land under their feet. What's helpful here, and this is something that's continually frustrating to me just in discussion of topics like this around the world, is that people have a hard time differentiating between nations, states, and countries. A nation is just a group of people. Palestinians have more recently been recognized as a nation by Israelis, as in there are Palestinians as a people instead of just calling them Arabs. So into the 70s and 80s and whatnot, they're all just the Arabs, and they just blended them together with all different people, and they made no distinctions, no differentiation, and that's just bullshit. That goes back to our discussions earlier about the whole process of Arabization with the Arab conquests, going back to, like, you know, the successors to Muhammad. I mean, the peoples in Iraq are descendants of, like, ancient, you know, Sumerians and Akkadians. Peoples in Egypt are descendants of pyramid builders. Peoples in North Africa are descendants of, like, all the different Tamazight cultures. I mean, they're not from Arabia. Palestinians are a distinct people with a distinct history in the Levant that goes back thousands of years. But the Israelis didn't recognize that until very recently. Now they'll recognize there is a Palestinian nation. A state is a government that is considered responsible for that people. They still don't really recognize that. The Palestinian Authority is basically like a series of autonomous institutions that still kind of like they're adjunct to the Israeli state. It's not really recognized as a co-equal government to negotiate with. So they haven't fully recognized its state. And a country is a state that has sovereign control of land. No Israeli government has ever, from the pre-state period all the way to today, ever said that they will tolerate the existence of another country between the Jordan and the sea. There's never been any possibility of that. So no Palestine as a country can exist from the Israeli perspective. This is why ultimately the problem is how Zionism is conceived, and why we kind of have to go back to the old discussions of binationalism from the 20s and 30s. Because as long as Israel is conceived as a Zionist state, as an ethno-national state for Jews only, then the only possible solution here is genocide. You have to remove the people entirely. And that doesn't necessarily mean just killing them outright. It could mean drive them out completely from the land, like remove them entirely from Palestine. And at that point, eventually they just get assimilated into different territories, and what makes somebody Palestinian goes away. Just like, I don't know, what made somebody Prussian is now gone. Like, I mean, tons of previous national identities no longer exist in the world. And that is a long-term process of genocide. That's the only possible end goal to the current conception of Zionism. For this to survive and for there to be any kind of like a real viable solution that has any kind of justice for other peoples, Zionism has to be rethought. It has to cease to be an ethno-national movement.
Yeah. And this leads me to my next question, which we'll hear this a lot. People say this all the time, which is, if we didn't want to live with Palestinians, or we weren't willing to, why are there so many Palestinians in the government, in the Knesset, or in a thing, and how are they so equal? Clearly, we treat them amazingly.
They were giving them citizenship was forced on them internationally. They had no choice in the matter. It was a condition of actual international recognition of Israel, which is why they had to drive as many of them out as they could. So they managed to drive out, 760, 770,000 some people. They're left with, 150 some thousand, 140,000 some people. So there are some Palestinians who are still inside Israel at the time. But while they were technically made citizens, they spent 20 years under military rule, subject to constant dispossession and discrimination during that period. And since that period, since the military rule ended in 65 or 66, they've continued to be subject to tons of apartheid laws where they're not actually like whole cities are like no Arabs are allowed to live there. There's legalized discrimination there. Businesses can legally discriminate. No Arabs work here, right? I mean, that's totally legal. It's like it's like Jim Crow in a sense. Yeah. So they're technically citizens, but there are different rules that apply to them than other people. There's tons of places they cannot live, cannot rent, cannot work, where Jews can. And they've continued to be subject to land seizures and to tons of discriminatory practices. Whole cities have been created for Israelis by seizing land from literal Palestinian citizens of Israel.
Yeah, those are the. Me and Hibbo were actually just talking about this, and I was reading through the laws where they basically say the
absentee laws.
Yeah, the absentee laws that they could just take.
Oh, so that's for like the people. That's for the 47 to 48 laws there. So anybody who was just gone, like if you're just gone for the weekend or whatever, we can seize your land. All that land is given to the JNF, and once it's there, it falls into its discriminatory constitution, which means that it can never be sold and it can never be leased to a non-Jew. Doesn't matter if you're a citizen of the state, it cannot be leased to a non-Jew, even if it was previously owned by Palestinians. But I mean, it's continued to happen. So as a fun one, look up the Judaization of the Galilee. It's a process that was taking place in the 1980s. In northern Israel. So this is an area where tons of Palestinian villages still exist, and they were intentionally seizing land from tons of these villages and turning it over to new settlements, new towns, new cities. The city of Carmiel in the Western Galil was built on Palestinian land that was seized in the 1980s.
So we see, and this is kind of important because the narrative is always like pretty much every inch of land is always taken legally in a nice form. We pay them, we this, we that. But that's what I kind of want to address because like my grandmother, I have the paperwork for. I think I brought it to class once in one of the classes that you had. That I think I took your Israel Palestine 3000 class, but I have like the paperwork from the land that we owned from Mandate Palestine. I have all the paperwork, the mortgage, everything on that land, but we had to leave it. My grandmother had to leave it, and then they just took it. And so to those people who say like, oh, this was, yeah, we know pretty much all the land was taken. We always paid them. How much of the land are we talking about in general of the country that was quote unquote stolen?
Well, again, in mandatory Palestine in 1947, Jews owned 6% of the land. If you look at the UN partition lines and look at the 56% of the country that was slated to be the Jewish state, within that territory, they still only owned 11% of the land. So most of the land where Jews live was not acquired in any legal fashion. The narrative inside Israel and largely from places like the U.S. was always, the Palestinians voluntarily left. They just left because they didn't want to live here, or the Arab armies told them to leave. We've known that was false all along. The Palestinians themselves have been saying it consistently since the 40s, and their own records have been talking about their forced expulsions. But even setting aside their own oral histories and what was documented there, we've known it's patently false since the beginning of the 1980s, when the documents were unclassified, and Israeli historians and sociologists and whatnot began looking back at these archives and realizing, you know what? Our government fucking lied to us, because look at all this shit. We've been talking about this for ages. I mean, it's getting okay. So books like this do exist in Israel that talk about the destruction of tons of villages, but you're not going to find this in a common bookstore. People don't want to hear about this. It freaks them out. It's like it feels like it delegitimizes the state. In the same way that a lot of Americans didn't want to hear about the ethnic cleansing of most of the U.S. and the breaking of 200 treaties with sovereign nations here.
What's the book again? They're asking what the book. Can you read it to them?
Oh, it's in Hebrew, so it's not going to do anybody any good here. But this is actually erased from space and thought, I guess. Consciousness, thought. It's basically an Israeli book about the destruction of 400 some villages. We now know it's more like it's over 500. I think that the current accepted number is about 531. But at the time this came out, they had documented more than 400 of these, villages that were depopulated, generally by force. Surrounding them, opening fire and chasing people out. In quite a few cases, there were massacres that the people didn't go right away. Usually, once you started firing, people just grabbed their shit and fled. Yeah. But if that didn't happen, they would line some guys up and just start shooting them until people grabbed their shit and left. That's how most of the land ended up in the hands of Israel. You had to chase 770,000 people off of their land.
Yeah.
Sorry, can people get? They're trying to find the author as well, because people do speak Hebrew. There are some people that do speak Hebrew in the chat that want to know if that's okay.
Oh crap! Let's see how I can read this here. Then, so this one here. When did I get this here? So this is Nova Kadman is the author. It's when did this come out? I can't find the year. 2008 is this one. So it's a really publication from 2008. But you're not going to find this like in a Steinmatsky or something. I got this from a university library.
Thank you so much.
And then
you should look into translating the text and publishing and selling it.
Well, I mean, there's tons of later books that have continued to build on that, and there are some in English too. So like a simple one in English, like the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, uses that material, but also much more. Like, because people have continued to go through these archives, find more and more of these records, and it's a real art to blend the Israeli archival data with the Palestinian oral histories that were collected over many years. So there's a lot of interesting research that does that. But the point is, Israelis have had access to this information since the 1980s, when their own material was finally declassified. So even setting aside that Palestinians have been saying it for the previous 40 years. Israelis have also had access to it for another 40 years on their own. Like, it literally exists already, but they don't want to deal with it. And we, in the U.S., are mostly completely blissfully unaware of how this shit works. So people can still fall for the whole, we just bought the land, and then other people fled during the war and they chose to pick up and leave, so we just took it afterwards. Well, even if you were going to take seriously that horseshit story, and there's no reason that anybody ever should have taken that seriously, but even if you did, why has Israel consistently refused a right of return to that land? Because to them, they can't allow it to come back because it's an ethno-state. If people get the right to return to their land, and that is international law. It was actually the U.S. position, and the U.S. in the 40s said you have to allow them to come back, and we're still saying it over and over again for a long time. Our official position was that they had a right to return. But we've eventually given up in pushing the Israelis on this, and they get to keep their narrative on it remains here. But the fact is, this land was all seized from people that were chased out of their homes. The villages were bulldozed. The land was turned over to the JNF and then given over to redevelopment for new migrants into the state. And they never had any intention of giving land back to the people who were chased off of it. So the country is formed in a series of war crimes.
And this kind of leads me to something that we talked about, me and you, privately, like last week, and then real quick before, guys, remember, tap the screen. Let's get to 500,000 likes, and make sure to throw all donations. I want to see you guys spam it. McLovin, Hiba, and Caucasian Arab, if you guys have questions, I'm going to ask one more question. I'd love for you guys to unmute and ask a question. It could be about anything, but the one I want to talk about, which kind of leads into the whole Plan D, but we talked about this, and you even said we were talking about it. That's one of many. That's a small thing. But can you talk a little bit about, because I think, again, the problem is the problem us all these Arabs that are on stage here and that we run into every day when we debate is they play the narrative of, Palestinians, Muslims have been attacking for so long, and that's why in 48, when they attacked first, we just attacked back. But can you talk a little bit about the type of paperwork and the type of cataloging that the Zionists did against those who even fought in World War I to make sure that they were prepped for this battle? We talked about this, how they were cataloging everyone. This is really interesting.
Oh, they were cataloging people who participated in the Arab Revolt in the 1930s. So under the British mandate, they basically opened a floodgate to tons of people moving in. So there's a whole bunch of Zionist migration in. And a lot of that is driven by the anti-Semitic policies in Europe. Obviously, the Nazis and shit like that. Tons and tons of the mood's turning against people. And a lot of people are like, we're getting the fuck out of here. And a lot of countries had strict quotas and didn't want to change those. After World War I, the U.S. and a bunch of other places started limiting how many people can move in. So not all Jews could get to places like the U.S. or Canada or whatever. So some of them ended up going to Palestine. So tons and tons of middle-class people are pouring in. So the Zionist population shoots way up. And that ends up leading to a Palestinian revolt where people start lashing out. And some of that is strikes and boycotts, and they're just shutting down the port and not showing up to work, crap like that. When that doesn't work and they just start getting replaced, then it starts turning to more violence, and they're like shooting things and derailing trains and shooting at cars and crap like that. The British put this down with tremendous force, and they start working directly with some of the Zionist paramilitaries, particularly Haganah. So Haganah is able to gain all kinds of interesting tactical experience at counterinsurgency. The Israeli practice of home demolition was actually learned from the British in this period here. But when the 47 fight breaks out, Palestinians are disarmed. In the wake of the 36 to 39 Arab revolt, the British had done such a thorough job that the Palestinians were basically reduced to steak knives. They didn't really have weapons anymore. So they couldn't put up a fight in 47. So it's why, as soon as the partition plan is being discussed, the Zionists start pushing Palestinians out of more territory to expand what they'll be able to claim when it comes down to declaring independence, and the British finally leave in May of 48. So they're attacking people in November and December of 47 already. And that continues for months. And that's not Palestinians shooting first. That's the Zionists pushing them out. But when they go into these different areas, they're able to kind of round up any veterans of the Arab revolt, people who had participated in it. They've found informants, they've gathered names or whatever. And if they go into a village. They've got, an informant with a mask on his head to disguise his identity, and he's like, identity that guy, and that guy, who are all, they all participated in the revolt here, and then you just take out and shoot those guys. So there's a kind of there's a sense of revenge that's playing out in them, because from the Zionist perspective, they're also fighting a kind of anti-colonial battle against the British, but they're also trying to drive the Palestinians absolutely have to accept their inferior status or just leave from their perspective. So anybody who has resisted that, anybody who is remotely willing to resist that ethnic cleansing is a threat that has to be shot.
And then this leads me to a question that I'll let you answer, and then if they have a question I want them to ask, and I'm going to run and grab something while you answer it, but I'm listening, which is, can you talk a little bit about the war? Because a lot of people are saying here, but wait, I don't get it. Didn't the Arabs the Palestinians have an army? Can you talk about 48 war and how, because we hear this a lot too, which is, and this is obviously just a ridiculous Harry Potter stupid game that I hate playing with people, where they go, the reason we won and show cases why we should have the land is clearly how could one nation so small take over 5 Arab nations? God is on our side. Can you talk about the actual facts of that war? What did it look like? How big were these armies? Were they all invading at once? Can you kind of give people an environmental contextual understanding of how that battle looked like?
Sure. The short of this is obviously Palestinians had no armed forces at all. They, again, had been disarmed during the Mandate period and had no governing institutions, no weapons of any sort. So they were just getting steamrolled. Nearly all of the fighting in 47 and 48 is against Palestinians, though. The 6 Arab armies that supposedly all participated in this, and it's always Israel gets attacked by 6 Arab armies at the moment it declares its independence. Look, they wanted to destroy it. And it's held up as some kind of David and Goliath struggle, but the Goliath, is actually the Israelis. The Haganah alone, the largest paramilitary, at the beginning of the fight, already had more people under arms than all these Arab armies combined. And it still had reservists it could call up, tons of people with experience fighting before that it could put back under arms. And you still had the smaller paramilitaries, Lehi, Irgun, and whatnot here. So they had far more people, and they had far more military experience, because you had World War II and World War I veterans. You had people that had been part of these paramilitaries for a long time. They'd gotten experience working with the British and kind of counterinsurgency activities. Among the different Arab states involved here, interestingly, and this trips people out today because it's such a poor country overall, Jordan actually had the most professional army of all of them. Because Jordan was closely allied to Britain in the empire. British officers have been training it for some time. They were the best equipped and best armed, best trained of these Arab armies, and they had no interest in fighting. The only place they put up any resistance at all was in the area around Jerusalem, to make sure that eastern Jerusalem would stay under their control. But they'd already made a deal. Abdullah had made a deal already with the Zionists to divide up and take portions of what becomes the West Bank. So all he did was he kept his troops in those areas. They did no actual fighting. They didn't attack. They didn't invade. They did not fight at all. The Lebanese, they stayed in Lebanon. There's a couple of periods where they occasionally came across and helped out some of the villages very close to the Lebanese border once the Zionists were ethnically cleansing it. But that's already after nearly all of the northern, nearly all of the Galilee had already been ethnically cleansed. So they're trying to get every single bit of this. And mind you, nearly all of that land had been slated to be part of the Arab state. So it was technically given to whatever Arab entity would have been there. But the Zionists decided, we're taking all of this, and they did. The Lebanese, for the most part, stayed on their side of the border, came across a couple of times to reinforce a few Palestinian villages that wanted to put up a fight. But then the Zionists actually moved into Lebanon and took some territory there, and then they ended up deciding to pull back from that and give it up. But they actually pushed the fight into Lebanon. Egypt, its army was pathetic. In fact, the best fighting force that the Egyptians even had was half of their force was actually not even army. They were irregulars. They were Muslim Brotherhood volunteers who wanted to go and fight fight there, because the Brotherhood had already expanded into Palestine. They had some interest in fighting there, and they had no training at all, and consequently did terribly on the field of battle. But they at least fought harder than the Egyptian army did. The Egyptian army, they basically cut and run whenever they saw the Zionists coming. They did almost nothing. Oddly enough, some of the Syrian and Iraqi contingents actually fought a little bit better, but that's largely concentrated in a few areas in the northeast, and even there, they ultimately lost everywhere and ended up having to retreat. But they did. The Iraqis and Syrians both at different points did manage to reinforce a few Palestinian villages, and as a consequence, this is part of the reason that. You asked earlier, like, oh, look, Israel still has some Palestinians. It still has some Arabs there, right? The reason that most of them are still there is because of those defenses of those villages. Some of them put up a fight. They organized themselves. They mostly had antiquated weapons or no ammunition or whatever here, but some of these people that came in from the outside helped to reinforce them. They had a few guns. They were often massively outclassed, but sometimes there was just too many villages to take. There were too many places to go. So some of them ended up being, oh, okay, looks like they put up a fight here. We're going to go on and we'll attack these guys instead over here, and we'll come back there later. And they just never did. But it's not like they didn't try. But a handful of places end up surviving because they put up a fight. That's the main role that any of these armies played. It was just putting a few extra soldiers on the ground with some bolt-action rifles, no real serious equipment, maybe some surplus World War I shit that they're still holding on to. They didn't really have any real equipment. This is not like modern armies. It's completely different than the way people imagine this happened. It looks nothing like it.
Yeah, no, that makes, and then someone said something. By the way, Hiba, Rima, McLevin, do you have any questions?
No, I'm just listening, but what Liam is saying is so my dad, he was in the Gaza province when he was 16, and then when that specific war broke out, he was actually in Jordan, and he actually told me the same exact thing. So the Arab armies actually didn't put up a fight at all, and
they were pathetic.
There's even speculation that the Jordanian government had made this deal, but in order to bolster its population, because the Palestinians needed to go somewhere, and the population of Jordan at the time was very low, and so I guess bolster the economy, give it a workforce, give it a population. This is why Jordan was one of the only countries to offer Palestinian refugees a citizenship, which I do hold. I'm a second-generation refugee there, and Palestinian populations in Syria and Lebanon actually hold just minor, refugee documentation.
Right.
So this is just like an addition to that conversation. But if I have a question, I will step in and ask. Thank you, Dom.
Yeah, the Syrians at one point offered to get citizenship and permanently resettle somewhere between 300 and 350,000 Palestinians there. But that was if the Israelis were willing to share Lake Kinneret with them. And when Ben Gurion said "fuck no," that the Syrian ruler was basically deposed and killed, and the offer disappeared. The only Arab state to actually carry through and offer citizenship was Jordan. But yeah, the story, there were rumors that went around at the time, so I'm not surprised your family would have heard that about the collusion across the Jordan. That was later proven. Because again, these archives they all became available. In fact, one of the later prime minister, Golda Meir, was actually one of the ones involved in the negotiations, kind of like slipping across in disguise and carrying out discussions with the king there. Yeah. They had it planned out to begin with.
And also, one thing that my dad did recall as a refugee when entering Jordan was that there were skirmishes where Israeli forces, Zionist forces, were attacking Jordanian forces, and the Jordanian army themselves, the military itself, wanted to join, and they were like communicating with themselves, do we join, and then they got communication from a higher command to basically leave it alone and refuse to interfere. And this happened a lot. Right. The idea that the Israeli government or the Israeli military took on 6 Arab nations and won simultaneously is like one of the most ridiculous narratives.
It's a myth. I mean, but it's a useful myth. It's one that, and this is where it's difficult to discuss these things now, because all countries have a national mythology about their founding, and no one wants to go back and look at that later because they feel like it's somehow delegitimizing you and whatnot. So it becomes an attack on your identity. There's a similar situation in the foundation of the U.S. that people tend to forget about too. You know, a ton of people in those 13 colonies that were rebelling against Britain were actually loyalists and did not want to break away, and they were attacked. They were harassed. They were murdered. People were being some people were driven over the border into Canada. I mean, and we just simply forget about that whole ethnic cleansing too, because it's just not a part of our story. We want to think that everyone was united and think, yes, we are Americans and we're all united against Britain, and but we weren't. Tons of people here thought of themselves as British. They didn't want to break away. But that's not a useful thing to tell people. That's not useful in the national myth. Every country has these. So the Israelis don't want to talk about that shit, and for good reason.
It's interesting
we
too.
have to.
It's interesting too. Someone just joined in and goes, "Oh, are we talking about the Nubka myth?" And I'm like, okay. But here's what I wanted to show too. So during that time, let me see if it's flipped. Let me mirror myself. There you go. So this is my great-grandmother's passport, and this is when she was displaced and got her Jordanian one. And at that time, they put men and women on the same passport, so the little stamp in there. And here, I'll show you the photo. So I have all the paperwork, it's all right here, all the land paperwork, everything.
Did somebody really say Nakba myth?
Yeah.
It's amazing that's the one that's looked at as a myth now. But again, it just shows you how much the national origin myth has taken root for people. It's hard to look back at this. Again, Israelis have known this shit for decades. They know the Nakba is real. Their own records say it, but people don't want to face that.
Yeah, this was our mortgage paperwork for the land in Ramallah.
I mean, they want more information on the Nakba, and they want to, look up the documentary Tantura. I believe that's what it's called, and you guys can hear firsthand from Zionist militias at the time who will tell you all of the gruesome, horrendous stuff that was done. And you guys can have fun with that, I guess. But
some of our best sources on it actually are Israeli. They're members of the either the militias or the early IDF that actually were documenting this stuff afterwards and describing the rapes, the executions, the driving out. It's not all based on Palestinian oral records. We have a bunch of that, but we have a ton of material recorded by Israelis at the time. So we're not just depending on my people's memory later. Oh yeah, I did this thing. And plenty of people come up later and did interviews in the 70s, 80s, 90s. Oh yeah, no, I totally participated in a massacre. But memories can shift over time, whatever. No, we can look back and see, oh yeah, what he's saying matches records from the time that his detachment actually turned into command. And all that stuff got filed away. Well, it eventually got declassified. And it got declassified only at the point where the myth had so taken root that they knew it wouldn't matter. That only scholars are going to care about this stuff. And that's where it's basically stayed for 40 years. There are people who know and who care, but most Israelis are never going to encounter this stuff.
No, they don't. I mean, for example, I just showed the paperwork of the house, and then their response was, "That's fake. How can a house cost $3,500?" And I'm like, well, back in the 30s and 40s, I was like, that. Yeah, I don't know.
Are you fucking kidding?
We
look at the U.S. in that period. I mean, come on.
So this is my great-grandfather worked for the government of Palestine. This is his paperwork. That's his salary right there, everything there. And you can see that when he got fired, a nice unique date there. And so it's just funny because this is what we deal with every day. Like I'll say, hey, here's the actual mortgage paperwork. Here's the contract. Here it is right here. We can look at where's the city in it. Right here it says this is the mortgage. Right, it says all the paperwork for it, and you can see right here it says Ramallah, Palestine. And then it's just immediate, like, no, this is fake. That's not real. You didn't. And this is what we kind of go through a lot, which is like, everything is fake. There's no sources. This is not real. And they kind of just want to microaggression of like, oh, like none of this happened. It's all fake, made up stuff. But I get it because it's one of those things where like, and when you touched on this, and this is why I went on to do my master's in psychology after working with you on my international relations master's and my bachelor's over there, which was the psychology of it. Like, why do people want to immediately just lies? Why? What is the psychology behind it? Why not go? I'd love to see if that's true.
Well, again, it's this is one of the things that got me interested in these kind of topics. It's the way that these big ideas, these systems of thought, the concepts, ideologies of nationalism also affect our construction of subjectivity, our sense of self. And taking on this kind of like ideological framework shapes who people think, how they think of themselves, who they think they are. So any challenge to those ideas, any factual criticism of those ideas is taken as a personal attack. So it's very difficult to take in those facts. You immediately run into cognitive dissonance on this. You have to find some way to reject it. There's just tons of examples of this in tons of different areas. Look at the way that in the U.S. today, like neo-Nazi movements will simultaneously recycle exactly the same propaganda that Nazis used to justify killing Jews and then deny that the Holocaust happened.
Yeah.
Because the problem here is that if you take seriously the consequence of those beliefs, then it kind of makes you an evil motherfucker, and no one wants to be the bad guy. So you have to think it's possible to hold these beliefs without the logical consequence.
Yeah.
Like there's a disconnect in between that gets replicated in countless circumstances all around the world where people don't want to look at these things.
I mean, and it really, so we didn't really get to talk about this, me and you, Liam, but like I actually went on to work as a mental health therapist for Muslim refugees, and I worked as a marriage and family therapist, and a lot of these like kind of relate, which is like, you talk to a client, you talk to a patient, you say, hey, like, here are the things that you've done wrong. No, I want to point out what they did wrong. And people don't tend to want to ever look at anything they did, but what I want to do is read, while you pull up some stuff too, is read some of the funny comments that we get every day to kind of get your reaction of it. But here's an example. When I showed the paperwork, they said, yeah, go on.
Yeah, sorry. No, I have my video. I have a video on my page, Liam. It's like 20 or so screenshots, combined messages of like people, the comments that you would get under like, because I've been hosting lives about Palestine for about a year or two, but probably over two, like, a year and a half. And the hate that we get is just really interesting. And the fact that I'm a woman makes it a lot more crazy.
Yeah.
And
people suddenly feel empowered to be all misogynistic and it's
so yeah, if you ever want to look at it, like it's on my page, just everyone go look at it. It's like the fourth probably video there, but it's like a screenshot, like screenshots, and I kept their usernames, because I'm not, I'm gonna expose y'all asses, but go ahead, Dominic.
No, yeah, here. So
when somebody is particularly dickish, when I reshare things, those are people I leave their names on because
here's like a haters. So I showed that paperwork. They said that paperwork's not real because Palestine didn't exist. It was under the Ottoman British rule.
Okay, but they called it Palestine. So hello.
Yeah, that's
like the Palestine mandate that the British put together was called Palestine. It had Palestinian money. Like hello.
One of the most frustrating things, sorry, Dominic, one of the most frustrating things about all of this, right, is the fact that we always have to be like 30,000 steps ahead. We have to be like the best, like the most well-read, the best, the most like well-spoken, more eloquent, more emotionally regulated, all of these things, and we still get told we're nothing, we're animals, we're people, like we're not even people, and they will still give us, what about Hamas? So the same way that like that guy who was here earlier, I forget his name, the Moroccan kid, and he's like, well, talking about genocides of Palestinians in Palestine, well, what about the Jews who got massacred in like Morocco? Like what? Like stay on like.
But like, what? Yeah, what aboutism is a dishonest, rhetorical strategy used. Like, what aboutism is a dishonest, rhetorical strategy used. Like, what aboutism is a dishonest, rhetorical strategy used. Like, what aboutism is a dishonest, rhetorical strategy used. Like, what aboutism is a dishonest, rhetorical strategy used. over and over again. It's people do that when they know they can't actually address the topic under consideration.
Yeah, and that's the problem. That's why I brought him up, because we had this long debate where it was just this whole like, well, the reason why we attacked you guys is because you've been attacking us for so long. And I'm like, this is a stupid game of, well, you were attacked over here. And he goes, yeah, but you have to understand what it feels like. I go, I don't give a shit. I'm not going to leave a country where I was attacked and then get into a new place and just assume I'm going to be attacked so I get to attack other people. This is a ridiculous sentiment.
And like,
yeah, so people who share my religion are attacked somewhere completely different, therefore I feel justified in attacking you. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
I mean, it's okay, so if you're going to take that seriously, then sure, why didn't Irish Americans, I mean, some Irish Americans actually tried to launch an invasion of Canada, which is fucking hilarious. Like Irish Americans literally got some guns, crossed the border into Canada and started shooting British people because there were Irish being shot by the British in Ireland.
Yeah.
Right?
we have a drink called the Irish car bomb.
To then justify that and say that's good, they should do that.
Yeah.
Like, I'm sorry to cut you off. Go ahead, but it's like we have a drink that all Americans love and drink, right? The ones who do drink, called the Irish car bomb. Yeah, we are animals. We're animals, right?
Yeah.
Tactics.
Yeah, what's great though is that the people who are often doing the kind of dishonest arguments you're talking about literally end up justifying the logic of terrorism themselves.
Wait, someone just said, why would Brits hurt its Irish people?
Because the Irish are not British.
White people all don't like each other.
No, they
Britain
were.
is a completely different island. Britain is the island that England and Wales and Scotland are on. Ireland is a different island.
And Irish were not considered white until more recently. That was a.
Well, that's in the U.S. That's a different circumstance. But yeah, like the Irish weren't white, the Italians weren't white.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when my family got here in the late 19th century, none of us were white.
Yeah, they just shifted.
Can I ask my questions that I had real quick? I'm sorry.
Yeah, go, please.
I know I was talking, but I was just whatever. I wanted to ask a few questions, right? So, one, I have like multiple, but I think before we like go into like more modern day, I want to talk more about history since we're still on the topic of history, and I want to talk about a lot of. So okay, I always found it's maybe not like a question, but maybe like your opinion, but like I always found the relationship with Zionism and fascism to be so intriguing to me. Like we see Mussolini gifting Jabotinsky the Batar Naval Academy in Italy. We see like Jabotinsky and Mussolini saying, if you want to see what fascism, asking about what fascism is, he says, look at Zionism, right? And then you see it later with the Havara Agreement. We see it with the other agreements and arrangements that went on during Nazi Germany, which is why I make a claim that Israel doesn't care about the Jews. And and like the same thing with like Ben Gurion saying, and I quote, the catastrophe of the European Jewry is none of my business. And and it's just so intriguing to me. So I wonder, like, if you have any more information about that, where I could learn more about that, or what your opinion.
Oh my gosh!
So we just talked about that too. Yeah.
Nationalism and fascism are major research interests of mine. Like, so we're on the smaller side of my office here. So like this is an alcove that kind of back-to-back bookcases cut the room in half. The larger half there, I mean, it has an entire wall on nationalist and fascist thought, and then a whole nother section that's all on like Nazism and all that crap. I mean, it's the parallels are obviously there, and it's fascinating that it's one of those places where it's so difficult to look at because the Holocaust is such a significant cultural trauma that no one wants to consider that Zionism actually replicates the same thing. But that was true from the beginning. The people who, whether you're talking about left or right Zionists, they thought that they were creating new Hebrews. They looked at the Jews of Europe who stayed behind and got killed by the Nazis as like they're part of the problem. We don't care if they die off. We want like the good, strong people who are fight back. They're the ones who should come here and we'll kick ass. They really didn't care at all about traditional Jews. The Jews who wanted to stay there and go to yeshiva or whatever, they're the ones that the Nazis were killing, not the nationalists willing to leave. it's not as straightforward a parallel for most of Zionism with overt fascism, but it is on the right. So like there's a ton of great work like that. Like Aaron Kaplan's book, like The Jewish Radical Right, looks at like so there's tons of great work on the right's ideals, and it is super hardcore fasci. But still, the left is still an ethno-national movement. Yeah. Which means it's walking a tightrope between socialism and fascism. And it has elements of both.
I always say this to there's no left in Israel. Like there's absolutely no left in Israel.
There is. There always has been, but it's historically been small. It's like
right. Not the leftists who are holding like the gay pride parade in an Israeli flag, like with Israeli flag colors. You know what I mean? Like those aren't the left. Like, those are parading.
Those are liberals. That's like calling Democrats leftist. Democrats are not leftist either.
And I think that like when people I'll have like. Sorry, I'm so sorry to cut you off, but I just want to say, I think it's so funny to me when someone, so I'm Lebanese and Palestinian, and I think it's really interesting to me when someone comes to me and they're like, oh yeah, I'm an Israeli, I'm a leftist, I don't like Bibi, I want, and then they talk about Sharon or Mayer. I'm like, huh? First of all, you're pro-Palestinian, you should value. You should understand that no leadership under Israel has been good to us. Ever.
Right. There was an Israeli Communist Party, though. There were actual leftists. And a lot of the left movements in Israel were for more binational solutions, because they did take seriously the whole class consciousness shit and not the ethno-national parts. So they were there, but they've never been dominant. They've never actually had power. It's the same dynamic you get in the U.S. where people think that Biden is some radical leftist. I'm like, dude, Biden is more conservative than Reagan is on many issues. Like, Biden is not on the left at all.
Right, no, fuck Biden. But do you remember what happened with the Black Panther movement in Israel? What happened is that they basically were fighting, I think, not alongside with the people in the West Bank, but they were fighting as well. They were fighting Israel as well in the 60s, 60s to 80s. Then they got rights, and they're like, well, fuck y'all, bye, I'm out. What happened?
Yeah, some elements of this have continued, though. I mean, I've actually marched with and worked with some anarchist groups in Israel that do work with Palestinians, and they structure all their organizations as they have joint leadership and participation there, so that there's a real sense of solidarity. And some of the smaller political parties that are in the Knesset are joint Israeli Jewish and Israeli Arab. And they take more leftist positions. But Labor was never really a truly leftist party because it was always an ethno-national party. So not Meir, not Ben Gurion, they're not really left. They're walking that tightrope between socialism and fascism. They're not actually on the left.
Okay. But yeah, that's I would agree with that 100%.
But it is a more complicated situation because there are still splits, and again, as a scholar, I have to quibble a little bit here and there, but there's a lot more places where you can get closer to that hardcore nationalism all across the Israeli spectrum than I think a lot of people would be comfortable accepting.
Someone said Rabin was left. No, he wasn't. Rabin
actually participated in massacres.
Yeah.
Rabin was a hardcore ethno-nationalist. Rabin was in no way a leftist. And what he was doing was in recognition of the existence of a large Palestinian population and the territory that they conquered in 1967. The reason that he was for creating some kind of autonomous sub-state in that area was more a recognition of the demographic threat to Israel's ethno-national character. It was a refusal to actually recognize the humanity and equality of Palestinians that drove him, not the opposite. People they hold him up as some lion of the left, and he's absolutely not.
This is perfect. Well, let's do. I don't want to take too much more of your time.
There was a point so I can put these back on there. Somebody had asked a question earlier about I can't remember where this came up, but on the Israelis giving rights to
the second class
the
treatment.
1948 Arabs and how they're treated. So like two fun ones to look at for that, as text here is like Shafir and Peletz being Israeli has some significant discussions there.
If you guys just screenshot it and then mirror it through your camera settings, by the way. So
what was that?
I was telling the viewers to screenshot that if they need it. Yeah.
Okay, so there's that here, and this is a lot of discussions of divisions within the Jewish community, especially between like the Mizrahim and Ashkenazim, and why some of the Mizrahim are far right. But it also discusses like the third class status of the Palestinians there. And then this one here is good on the earlier parts of the state. So this is Shira Robinson's Citizens and Strangers, and this is about the contradictions between Israel on the one hand theoretically creating a liberal democracy where they have citizenship, and at the same time creating an apartheid settler colonial regime where they live under military rule and are subject to expulsions and expropriations and everything else. So it's a pretty good look at that the weird contradictions of that the first 20 some years of that period. So like chronologically, like this first, and then this is looking at like the 70s, 80s, 90s.
I mean, it's kind of like saying we have black representatives and senators in the United States government, but
so therefore we're not racist. There's no racism in the
there's
U.S.
no racism in America. Like there's,
right. Exactly.
I always related to Jim Crow. I always related to Jim Crow.
Yeah, exactly. And it's very similar in that way. And it's worth pointing out that none of these parties have ever been taken into coalition. Some Israeli governments have actually depended in backroom deals on some of their votes, but they've still never allowed them to be a coalition partner. No Israeli government can accept these Arab parties in because it would undermine the Zionist narrative for the whole state. So it's a very complicated situation. They have a technical right to vote, but it doesn't matter much. It's sort of like, yeah, we can vote for the Peace and Freedom Party too, but so what?
Well, it's you know what it is. It's I'm sorry, Dom, to cut you off. This minority Palestinian population within what you quote unquote mainland Israel is, I always look at it as just for show, because they make up 20% of the population, and as long as they hold some type of majority, they will always control that. They will always control the country, the politics, the laws by a vast majority, a power wise. And then the way the right wing government will continuously demonize Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank. You'll always have this sort of schism between those two populations, even within mainland Israel, and this is one of the reasons why they support a one-state solution, but they'll never support. They want to annex the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, but they'll never support offering those people. Yeah, but those Palestinians will never get citizenship because. Right. The population at that point for the quote-unquote only democracy in the Middle East will be almost even, and this is not even considering the right of return for all of those refugees in Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. I said this in one of my videos. They want the land, they want their cake, and they want to eat it too, right? And whatever they have to do to expel first Gaza, because that is their biggest threat, right? They will turn towards, this is we're speaking on futuristic terms, right? They will turn towards the West Bank, and then after those are purged, if they succeed in purging those, they will turn on their own population.
Well, they have.
Yeah,
they
of course, yeah, but
the support for democracy in Israel has been declining for a long time. It's sort of similar to some of the patterns in the U.S. too, where support for democracy on the right here has also been in decline. But the support for democracy on the Israeli right has honestly never been there. I mean, again, its right is literally based in fascist militias, so it's never really been fond of it. But its power has grown because more and more of the left has just stopped voting or has been emigrating in large numbers. They have a greater and greater concentration of power, so they've been restricting tons and tons of rights. This is where Israel's never actually had a constitution, so it has In the absence of a constitution, it has common law, a few basic laws, and then Zionism as a guiding ideology, which means the ethno-national character of the state directs a ton of its basic policy positions, and that creates a ton of problems. You've got parties like Yisrael Beitenu that actually argue for taking portions of 1948 Israel and attaching them to the West Bank and stripping the citizenship of those people from them. You know, there's all kinds of horrifics. Oh, you've got people that are still like, you know, supporting the old Kachis movement that want to expel, to drive people out still. So they're still pro-ethnic cleansing. I see tons of like pro-ethnic cleansing slogans all over Israel.
Yeah, and I think that. Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Heba.
Lala. I was gonna say from like when people say, "Oh, from the river to the sea" means like this is about like whatever. You know, we've heard the tropes before. When in reality, if you look at the damn flag, their damn flag literally is from the river to the sea. Those two blue lines. If you ask any Israeli, like those two blue lines and the Star of David in the middle, literally means that. And then who was it? Was it Ben Gurion or was it the Likud party when they first went? They said that from the Galilee to the something, right? They said it basically differently than we say it. They essentially went from the river to the sea, but differently. Go ahead.
Again, the right in Israel, and even originally the so-called left, like the Ben Gurion type faction, originally wanted all the way up to the Litani River in Lebanon and the east bank of the Jordan as well. So it's the borders have always been pretty expansionistic. Like people like attack the logo for the old Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine for showing like the original mandate borders, you know, like of Jordan and Palestine together as like a Palestinian state. But they forget that the Irgun's logo had exactly the same design. All of Mandate Palestine and all of Jordan was the state that they wanted. The Israeli right always wanted all of that land.
Yeah, I mean, people think Bibi is like one of the most extreme people in the Israeli government, and he's
just vocal.
Compared to them, not even like compared to everybody there, their leadership, he's like pretty moderate. I mean, one guy yesterday.
I have a question.
Not actually moderate. He just moderates his statements in public because he's a politician.
I mean, one guy yesterday was like nuking Gaza is on the table, and like Bibi had to feel like this guy's cracked. If Benjamin Netanyahu has to come out and say you're cracked, you're on a different level of cracked. You're on a different
but
level.
he's also like he's the same one that said that it was the Palestinians who told Hitler to create the Holocaust. Like he literally said that when the Mufti met with Hitler and Hitler didn't want. He said, "What should I do about the Jews?" And he's like, "Well, you can't expel them, or they'll all come here to Palestine." He's like, "Well, what should I do about them?" It's like, well, you should burn them. And like immediately, Yad Vashem, the Israeli Holocaust Museum, had to contradict him and say, like, our prime minister's lying his ass off. I mean, he's done some really fucked up shit, and it's just that he plays the political game a little better and doesn't go for the extremely hyperbolic, like nuke them all kind of like statements. But he is for removing the Palestinians still.
Well,
his party has literally voted, like overwhelmingly to annex all the territory and not give rights and maintain permanent apartheid or simply expel them. He literally could not create negotiate a two-state solution because his own party doesn't support it.
Yeah,
it never has.
Two things I want to shift into. One, someone had commented something funny. They said, you get banned from going into the IDF if you don't like Palestinians. And I don't even understand where that would... I don't know. I just think that's hilarious. But moving forward, I think this is something really important because we were kind of getting into this, which is now we're getting into modern day, which is what happened, October 7th attack and blah, blah, blah. But I want to talk about the actual sentiment of the Palestinian people, and this is something that we talked about extensively, Liam, you, which is, and I was pulling up all the data on this, which is the number one sentiment that we get as Palestinians is, you voted for them, that's what you get, blah, blah, blah. Not taking into account all the context, but even if there were or there weren't, talk a little bit about what kind of support. Do people in Gaza love the caliphate? They want to go to a Muslim regime? What do they actually want? Talk about that. I have the data pulled up too, but I want you to kind of talk a little bit about that so people can understand what that landscape actually looks like.
I mean, just simply put, the Palestinians are among the most secular populations in the Arab world. They, many people, they have a religion, but they don't want a religious state. I mean, support for all of Hamas's goals and the actual imposition of a Sharia state is about 5%, which means fewer Palestinians support a theocracy than Americans, because there's a shit ton of American evangelicals who want a theocracy here. So it's like support for Hamas, it varies a lot over time and by location, but it can go anywhere from 20% to 50% or so, but that's largely because they're still willing to shoot back at the Israelis, and most Palestinian factions stop doing that. So it's all about the anger, the resentment, the desire to kind of lash out and resist and still fight for Palestinian independence, and they're still willing to do that. And people often get in bed with people with ideas they disagree with in any kind of revolutionary independence movement. Tons and tons of independence movements have had really diverse coalitions. I mean, this is just normal in the world. I mean, look at wildly different circumstances like the Iranian Revolution in the 78, 79, where you had, communists and conservatives and theocrats and, ethnic separatists and just, student liberals and just people that hated each other in every possible way. But they all said, fuck the Shah. I mean, in the current Hamas attack, the current fight there, the October 7th bit, it wasn't just Hamas fighters. I think it's honestly fascinating that we spend so much time talking about it, but it plays into America's war on terror and anti-Islamic rhetoric there. But some of the bigger atrocities and some really horrific scenes in the initial fighting there actually came from the socialist militias, because the Democratic Front and the Popular Front both participated, and they hadn't been involved in militant actions for quite a while. They had mostly eschewed that sort of thing, and it was left to the Islamist groups like Islamic Jihad and Hamas that were doing things. But the Popular Front participated in this attack, and they don't agree with Hamas on anything other than hating Israel. I mean, they're literally socialists. They're secularists. They don't have any interest in a religious state. But the goal there often in any kind of independence fights, in any kind of revolutionary movements, you always see coalitions of people that hate each other, and then they'll have to fight each other at the end or sort out whatever they want at the end of that process. But the initial target is what is the hated regime we have to get rid of. So that's, I think, most people's perspective on Hamas is they don't like them, but they kind of like that they're still willing to fight Israel.
And let's touch on this for a bit, because going to specifics doesn't matter if we don't get on the same moral page or understanding of the transnational issues that how countries gain independence. So let's talk a little bit about other countries. So a lot of people say
I saw a couple of questions there. I occasionally see ones that are interesting. Somebody asked if I'm a Middle East historian. Yes, that's one of my two teaching fields in my doctorate. So, and the Israel-Palestine conflict was one of my areas of research in my doctorate. And somebody else asked, what is the Popular Front? Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine was one of the original resistance groups. They were active in the 60s and 70s. They were a socialist and Marxist group, and the Democratic Front actually splintered off from them. And it again gets the fact that these are nationalist movements, and they were originally secular nationalist movements. Hamas is a much later development. All of the early developments, the PLO, Fatah, the Popular Front, the Democratic Front, they were all secular leftist movements. Only in the late 70s and 80s did you start to see some kind of Islamism appear there. Hamas didn't form until 87. So the Popular, the founder of the Popular Front is actually a Christian Palestinian, not even a Muslim at all. So again, resistance was much more diverse before, but these groups have been there. They've stayed around. They've just tended to slip into the background and have much smaller numbers now because groups like Hamas have kind of taken over. So
yeah, people kind of have this warped view as if Gaza is some sort of unique regime, that there's only Hamas, there's no other groups, there's no socialists, there's no communists, it's just strictly Hamas. They don't.
Palestinians have had a significant communist movement for about a century, and there still are communists in Palestine.
Yeah, and so let's touch on this, because I don't care to spend time on going over the semantics of what's happening at this current minute. But what I want to talk about is things relating to some sort of talk on civilian casualties and what that looks like for being the oppressed. So sometimes when I argue with people, they try and say like, oh, how can you ever justify it? I say, look, I never justify anything, but every country on the planet Earth has gained independence through violence, and most of the time civilians were killed or even targeted. But they try and say, no, Hamas is unique. They went out of their way to target civilians. Can you give us great examples of maybe in America or places that people adore that use the sort of violence that targeted, like a great example that I think I learned under you, or I think under the other professor at your school, which was in Algeria, right? Those targeting the French cafes and bombing these civilians. But can you give us examples of when targeting civilians happened in European nations, America, and so people can understand the context of how every nation has gained independence and what they had to go through to get there?
The Greek War of Independence involved attacks on Ottomans that attacked civilians as well as military forces. The Irish War of Independence involved attacks on civilians, and not even just in Ireland, but attacks on the British mainland as well. And that continued long afterwards because of the Northern Ireland issue. So, one of the reasons it was difficult for Britain to finally, talk to the IRA was that they were, putting, bombs and trash barrels in the streets of London and killing people. But it drew attention to the cause there. Over and over you see things like that all around the world. And it's not just, independence movements, but it also ties into like settler colonial movements. Look at the way that Canada, Australia, and the U.S., all attacked the indigenous populations and massacred them in huge numbers over and over again. Like, you keep recognizing these are sovereign nations. We can sign treaties with them and whatnot, and then we're going to allow our people to migrate in, take their land, and shoot them. And whenever people shoot back at the settlers, we'll send in the army and massacre people.
Yeah.
So the expansion of the U.S. across the continent, the expansion of Canada across the continent there, the expansion of Australia, all involved massacres against the actual recognized indigenous nations in these territories. And we always kind of excuse that. We always forget the fact that they are attacks on civilians. They're massacres of civilians all along. In our fight for independence, we attacked tons of the British loyalists here. We turned on civilians who were citizens of these, residents, whatever we want to call them, like of the colonies here. But if they were loyal to the British government, they could get shot, tarred and feathered, their property could be damaged or attacked. This is, it's different to accept the logic behind something than to say that it's necessarily a good thing.
Yeah.
I'm always in a tricky sort of situation there, because on the one hand, I'm a philosophical pacifist, and I prefer to find nonviolent solutions to things and to get people to talk together. I'm all for solidarity and blood brotherhood, cosmopolitanism, all that kind of shit. But on the other hand, I have to recognize that violence has frequently played a part in things. I'll give you a fun example out of the U.S., because a couple of times people brought up the whole Jim Crow parallel, and that happened pretty recently, actually. We like to look back today at the nonviolent tactics of Dr. King. And we're like, oh yeah, Million Man March, nonviolence, okay, that's how it worked, and that's why Johnson was willing to talk to him and all that. But the reason that King got invited to the White House, the reason they could have those conversations is because of the Black Panthers. It's because of it's because of militant movements. It's because of Malcolm X. It's because of the people who are willing to shoot back. That's what causes it's like the riots. You don't get discussion on civil rights without things like the Watts riots and crap like that. The violence is a language of the oppressed. It shows the problem underlying this. We can say that there's nicer ways to do this, there's better ways to do this, blah, 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 ethical ways to do this. So philosophically, you can have a whole different conversation. But if people are oppressed, they're going to shoot back at some point. There's no way around that. When people are always like, well, Hamas attacked first. Bullshit. Hamas was formed in 1987. The Nakba is in 1947. That's a 40-year difference between 47 and 87. You can't say that there wasn't some kind of cause for people to be angry and willing to shoot back. Now, I would have preferred, again, if I'd had my way, if I'd dictator of the universe for a second, I would have come up with some kind of binational solution that would have given equal rights to everybody, and you'd never have had a problem to begin with. But that didn't happen. Instead, you have a fight. You have dispossessions, and you have the consequences of those dispossessions, and the apartheid, and the giant outdoor prisons. And of course, people are fucking angry. A lot of Israelis or apologists in the U.S. will say, well, Israel gave Gaza back. They left Gaza. No, they pulled out the settlements. And then they have a giant-ass wall around it and troops and sniper towers and all the borders are closed off from it. They have no control over their airspace, no control over the coastline. They're prisoners, and they're literally stateless. They've never been part of any modern country. They can't travel. They can't do anything.
Wait.
They're trapped. So of course they're angry.
Guilt, and I don't like prisoners connotate a crime being committed.
Well,
that's the whole grand scheme of things. So I agree with you. I agree with you.
But people in a concentration camp are also prisoners too. Right, so it's so you're basically locked behind walls. Is the point? Exactly. They're walled in. They have no control over it. Gaza is not sovereign. It has no control over anything. They've just been partitioned off. A better parallel, if people want to understand it, is to look at the Bantustans of apartheid South Africa, where they created the fiction of an independent Zulu homeland and an independent Sotho homeland or whatever. They carved these areas out. No country in the world believes that they were actually countries because they weren't. They weren't sovereign. It was just a way for the South Africans to wall off a certain area and then ignore it and leave all the poverty and oppression in those areas and not let them into the rest of the country. That's what Israel's done. It's walled off certain areas and then pinned the Palestinians into those areas. So that is a form of structural violence. People are angry. People are hurt. They're lashing out. What Hamas is doing, as reprehensible as some of their tactics are, they're understandable because of the oppression that they face. And if we don't want the attacks, the single biggest thing for people who are understandably I don't want buses to explode. I don't want cafes to explode. I don't want violence. No one should be shooting up music festivals. Okay, cool. I agree with you. So let's solve the political problem. If you don't address the causes, you will never stop the terror. So people who refuse to address the causes, they are the biggest threat to Israelis. They are the biggest threat to Jewish lives. They are literally saying, I want more Jews to die, because they are going to keep Palestinians in a situation where they're going to keep turning to Hamas, and these attacks will keep fucking happening. That pisses the fuck out of me. I don't want people blown up at music festivals any more than anybody else does. But it's going to keep happening. And you can't bomb your way out of that.
Yeah, which is something that we talked about. And this is something that me and you had this discussion about. And this is, again, why I wanted to really get into psychology and understand it, which is people think that the way out of this is get rid of Hamas and then everything's solved, which is, it's the quite opposite, very similar to in America. You can't progress as a nation if you are being occupied by another nation. The only way for you to modernize is by not having the shackles of occupation on you, because like you said, then they're forced to get in bed with people they don't want because they have other problems they're trying to solve. And so
this is the fact that there were tons and tons of Palestinian resistance movements before this. You could kill every single leader and every single soldier of Hamas, and they would immediately create a whole new organization that would do exactly the same things.
Because
you're not doing the problem. So you're either be honest and say you're in favor of genocide, or at least, I don't know, be a little bit honest about it and say, maybe we should look for another solution here, because you cannot just defeat Hamas that way. You can't defeat an idea of independence. It doesn't work. You can't kill an idea. It's like the whole war on terror thing was dishonest. You can't wage war on terror. Terror is a method of war. Terror is a tactic.
Yeah.
The way to defeat terror is to address the causes of terror. Why are people angry? What are they lashing out about? What do they lack? What is the problem here? Until you actually do that, you can kill as many terrorists as you want anywhere in the world, and they're going to keep coming back. France, you mentioned Algeria earlier. France completely defeated the FLN militarily.
Yeah.
They killed the militants. They caught all the leaders, but they still lost, because you can't defeat the idea. And what and did inspired tons of people to come out in the streets and continue to protest.
And what was the pressure there? It was, and this is what I try and tell people, is like, they say, well, why don't they just target only the IDF? That would be their goal if they can. But similar to in Algeria, if you put pressure on the civilians, you're far more likely to get a reaction and move forward than do it. But that wasn't the target in general.
That's hard. Honestly, a lot of the earliest attacks, this is where, if you go back to the earlier tactics, if you go back to initial attacks by like Fatah, when they were first doing this shit, that's what they did. They attacked police and military. But when Israel's response all the time was to attack civilians. So like Fatah would sneak across the border from Jordan and shoot up a police station or something, and then Israel would send in people and massacre, civilians. So you quickly lose that moderate sensibility. I won't justify that. I don't think the killing of civilians on either side was justified. I don't think Palestinians should do it or Israelis should do it. But the fact is, when one does it, the other will respond. And it just goes back and forth, tit for tat, for the rest of fucking time, until somebody takes a step back and says, I'm not going to do this shit anymore. And that has to be the more powerful player here. As long as Israel is willing to target civilians, the Palestinians will target civilians. If Israelis don't want civilians targeted, then they have to stop fucking doing it.
Yeah, and this is something that I wanted to touch on. I only want to do like 10, 15 more minutes here, but here's what I want to talk about and kind of get you to kind of go over, which is, one, people always ask, well, Hamas has to put down their weapons. They're the ones that go, no, when you're the one in the jail cell, the person outside of the jail cell has the power to have better negotiation tactics and actually set up, kind of being the bigger person, because you are literally the bigger power. And so the other person's already in the corner getting beat to shit, and then you're going, why don't you just put down your weapon and then I'll stop punching you? And you're like, but then I would die. I don't know what I'm gonna happen, but you're the one that needs to do it because you're the one that has the ability to defend themselves. But I want to talk about this because this is something that we get a lot, which is, well, the Palestinians are evil people. Look what they did. They went into Lebanon and started bombing and killing people, and they did it in Jordan. They just go around bombing and people, and that's why no one likes them. Can you touch a little bit about Lebanon, Jordan, and kind of the context of those situations? I don't want to go into like in depth and depth, but to give people context of, they don't just go around bombing people for fun or attacking people or shooting people.
Well, okay. First, I want to actually address the first thing you said there, the question about the bigger side putting things down, because there's an important, not only empirical but ethical argument to be made here. But the other part, like where you're asking about like Lebanon and whatnot, I'm not really sure what you're asking. So in a minute, come back and try and rephrase that so I get a sense of what you're really asking.
Yeah.
But okay, so I'm going to use just a couple of examples that I gave very recently, because I like doing this whole like this day in history kind of shit on my Twitters or whatever, and two that I did recently were, again, that whole Dakota War thing. In the aftermath of the Dakota War, so these guys have surrendered. They've put down their guns and literally surrendered, and they are prisoner soldiers from a recognized sovereign nation. The response of the U.S. government was to sentence 303 of them to death. So not having the guns doesn't mean you're safe, as long as the other power still dehumanizes you. An example from today I gave was from a slave uprising in one of the British colonies. So like one of their island possessions, these slaves just like, fuck this. And they basically left, but they didn't attack. They didn't kill the slave owners. They didn't burn property down. They just picked up and they left. And they were hunted down and massacred. And in the aftermath, a whole bunch of them were beheaded. So the powerful player still was willing to kill people. The way around this, the difficulty here, and people keep making the arguments about Hamas, you can't talk to Hamas until they put their guns down. That's bullshit. It never works. The trick here is, if you want them to put the guns down and negotiate, you have to actually meet them, and negotiate in good faith, which the Israelis have never done with the Palestinians. A good example of that is, and it's still flawed and problematic and never actually solves the problem truly, but think about the process that the Brits started with in Northern Ireland. They finally decided to say, look, we're going to talk to the IRA even though they have guns and bombs. They were willing to have those talks, and because of those talks, the IRA gave up the guns and bombs. Right? But as long as they were insisting that they do it first, the IRA's response was always this. And understandably so. There was no way they were going to come. There were no way they're going to give up their guns or their right to resist without actually getting something concrete for it. But when Britain came and started negotiating despite the guns, then they were able to actually reach an agreement to kind of power share in Northern Ireland that people could kind of live with for a while. It's still, again, problematic, but it takes courage for a government to be willing to negotiate with a movement. And the problem here is they have to recognize what they are. These are independence movements. These are movements of national liberation. They're not terrorists. George Washington was a terrorist too. As long as you call somebody a terrorist, you can't actually negotiate with them, which is why terrorist is a bullshit term in these contexts. Yeah. It describes a tactic, but when you tar the entire movement as terrorist, you start thinking, well, they just like to kill people because they like to kill people. They just want to kill all the Jews. You go back to how did George W. Bush talk about they hate our freedoms and they want to kill all Jews, kill all Christians. I'm like, bullshit. They just pull this shit out of their ass. It's never been the goal. There's an actual political problem, and you need to talk about the political problem. That's what and you can't require movements disarm before that happens, because that requires them to have surrendered in advance, and surrender in advance gets you killed. It doesn't actually get you anything. You have to negotiate from some kind of position of strength. So that's ultimately the goal, and this is the reason that Hamas is going to keep attacking. They'll keep attacking until somebody finally negotiates with them. So if Israelis want the attacks to stop, have those conversations.
No, and that kind of relates to the idea of if Hamas, let's say, were to give up their weapons, it could be potentially annihilation for them. Versus if Israel does it, it doesn't mean automatically they go away, right? Even if Hamas starts to attack, no one's asking.
Yeah, Hamas. Israel could say we're not going to attack anybody anymore. That doesn't mean Israel is in any way existentially threatened. Yeah. Hamas can't destroy Israel.
Yeah, exactly.
Israel can say I'm no longer going to bomb Gaza, and that will do nothing at all. Israel will still be exactly what it is. But if Hamas gives up its if Hamas gives up its weapons, that's the end of that. And there's, again, no possibility of Palestinian rights.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I'm going to have Hiba ask.
But you had a question before that I didn't quite understand about Lebanon.
Yeah, I'll explain it. I'll explain.
Okay,
so
cool.
Basically, what Israelis do, or people who just hate Palestinians like to do, is they tend to dehumanize Palestinians and kind of, blame them for everything that happened. The same way that we're blamed for the Holocaust, crazy enough. And then Palestinians are also blamed for Jordan and Egypt and the economic, crisis that we're seeing in Lebanon. It's you invited the Palestinians in, and then they started a civil war, ruined your economy. You look at these Arab countries, none of them want them. You expect us to take them when their own Arab Muslim country, they say it like that, Arab Muslim people don't even want them or save them. Look at Egypt. This is a common rhetoric. It seemed to dehumanize Palestinians. It seemed to continue the fact that we are inherently horrible, disgusting people just by who we are. And yeah, so this is basically what he's saying. That's basically what I think Dominic was saying.
Yeah, it's what it kind of gets to is that the surrounding Arab states, and this goes back to some of the dishonest rhetoric about the 48 conflict, they were never actually fighting for the Palestinians. They were fighting for territory for themselves. It was never really about, it's never really been about the way it's described. When tons of Palestinians ended up being expelled into these different countries, again, Jordan's the only one that gave them any rights at all. Everyone else tried to use them as bargaining chips. So they're held in a kind of resident status in Lebanon, but there's tons of jobs that they're barred from. They lack tons of rights. They're not citizens. So, but they're there. The problem is everywhere that they are, it does cause certain problems, but it's not because that they're Palestinians. It's because of the own fragile politics there. Lebanon's a good example of that. Lebanon was already a very fractious state. It had a very complex confessional state, and based on a fraudulent census from the 30s, and there was tons of tensions already, and everyone's stockpiling weapons. And okay, so sorry, Dominic, I'm going to say something shitty here about Christians in Lebanon here, but they were determined to hold on to power at all costs, even though they were a quarter of the population, and they opened fire on the Palestinians, and they did it because when the Palestinians were present in their country, when there was any kind of PLO leadership there, they had experience fighting. They had guns. They had training. So they were a destabilizing influence. And the terror that the Maronites faced there was that the PLO could train the Lebanese national movement, and then they could topple it because they're a majority of the population. There were tons of people that were reaching out to each other across religious lines. So they're Sunnis and they're Shias and they're Druze, and they're like, hey, why don't we just have a normal democracy instead of this weird sectarian bullshit that we have? And the Maronites like, no, we have the permanent lock on the presidency. You can't change this. So they shot the Palestinians first. The opening blow is the Lebanese Civil War was the Maronites committing massacres against Palestinians. So it's not the Palestinians that caused the problem, but their presence did.
It's interesting.
It's always more complicated than the weird narratives.
And this is something that I talk about. So I'm atheist. I don't care about that. That's why you can.
Well, somebody just said Lebanon was a Christian country. That's bullshit. It was never a Christian country.
It's the minority. It's been the minority.
It was always at best a third, usually more likely a quarter of the population.
Yeah, so this is something interesting. This is actually, so I'm atheist. I don't care. You can trash anyone. I don't care. But basically, and I think we talked about this a long time ago. It's just been 10 years since I've been in your class, which is my grandfather funded the Kitab, the phalangists. My grandfather bought the weapons for them. And when my dad, who was around at that time, he talked about it. He came in alive recently, talked about it, and said basically what happened on the ground from his perspective, and this is the narrative, and everyone has their own version, is hey, we were told by Israel, look, there's a bunch of terrorists in your south, go look for them. And they went in, and then one of the guys shot because he probably felt threatened. A bunch of military Christians were coming into the refugee camp. He shot at them, and then that's when the Christians just started opening fire and just shooting everyone. But
yeah, I've actually had I've actually interviewed unrepentant tigers and phalangists that are still proud of gouging out eyeballs and putting them in formaldehyde jars and chopping off fingers and carving crosses on people's chests. I mean, the problem there is nationalism. It's that France, while it was there in controlling the entire Syria region, it basically created separate national identities based upon sects. So instead of we all speak the same language and eat the same food and dress the same way, so let's have a common national identity. Well, that would be a threat to France because they could fight together against the colonizer. So instead, France got people to hate each other based upon their sectarian identities, and that just spiraled out of control.
I said this yesterday, Dominic.
Yeah.
I was yesterday.
Yeah, nationalism is a disease, and it gets into people's heads, and when it forms a part of your subjectivity, it's very easy to justify atrocities.
Yeah,
it doesn't matter whether you're Christian, Muslim, Jewish, whatever. Nationalism is always going to have similar consequences.
And this is funny. This is I don't know, you probably don't remember this because it was a long time ago, but I did an independent course under you, and mine was specifically focused on extremism, what causes extremism, and I studied. You gave me all these books, Violence in Late Antiquity, When Religion Becomes Evil, blah, 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 all these different things, and I wrote my thesis on it. But it kind of relates to I always make this joke of people are willing to literally kill each other over goddamn baseball teams. People's minds are so warped that it's always an us versus them, which is why in that paper that I did under you I studied even I think it was orangutan. I don't know, but orangutans, and how they would just, if they see an other, they just go murder them. They just immediately, that's one of the few animals that will just murder for the fun / tribe feel of oh, they're not one of us, just kill them. And I related it to all these different groups that just, it's just all this national identity, nationalism of just we group together, and anyone who's not us is just an enemy immediately.
Nationalism is based on in-groups and out-groups. So anybody who doesn't fit that group is therefore a threat.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, 100%. I'm gonna bring it to kind of a close, but I want to have, if any of you, Rima, again, Hiba, Big Lovin, do you guys have any last questions that we can go over? By the way, real quick too, can everyone please go follow Liam right now? He posted a bunch of different videos too, and go comment specific questions on his videos. You've already done stitches, right, or replied to comments and videos, correct?
I've cut a few pieces in, but I still haven't figured out the stitch thing. I mean, Dominic just got me into doing TikTok stuff. I've been on the internet forever, but I don't use every platform, obviously. Yeah, I finally decided to take a shot at the whole TikTok thing. So I'm gonna try. The problem with stitching so far is it means I have to spend time going through and watching a whole bunch of other people's TikToks and picking out whatever asshole I want to criticize. I haven't managed to make the time yet to start picking out pieces, and then I have to figure out, like, okay, how does it actually work? But I will.
Yeah.
I literally just started in the last week putting shit on TikTok, so I'm new to it. But I don't know, it's like 8 or 9 on there already.
So when people comment, you can actually like hold on their comment and it'll say reply with a video, and you can just reply and the comment will stay on the top. And that allows people to get context of what you're about to talk about. Because if they say like, can you talk about the phalanges? Like you immediately, it's hovering above your head. You just start talking on the recording. And now people go like, oh, I read the question. I get what he's talking. He's going to answer this question. So go ask a bunch of questions. You can also just film it indirectly if you want to, but either way. His username is literally there. Just click on him.
And his YouTube, he does have content about this. There's already content on this that he's made on his YouTube channel.
Yeah, I was more active there before too. I'm trying to get back to it. I've just been spending more time lately on writing than on doing video stuff. But Dominic's sucking me back into this stuff, so I'll do some videos too, and I'll interact with people. And I'm always, this kind of stuff is easy too. Like, you know, these conversations, if you guys want to do this again anytime, just let me know if I'll schedule it, you know, especially coming down on an evening like this, because, yeah, this is about the time I would go to sleep anyway, so it's...
McLovin, quick question. How much is 100K money-wise, just so you know, so you can get an idea?
It's like what he gets?
Yeah.
Like $500.
Yeah, $500.
Yeah, you just have to connect your PayPal to it, and it should put it down in your PayPal, and it should cash you out Wednesday.
Yeah. So,
well, if we do enough of these things, I can cut down some of my course load. I'll have more time to write. I'll finish that book a lot faster.
So that's what I wanted to get you into, is like kind of coming live and doing these like whatever weekly, bi-weekly, or every 2-3 weeks, because especially right now, given the topic, right, there's a lot of people looking to be educated, and you'd be surprised. I get DMs every single day about, oh, hey, can you talk more about this? Can you talk more about that? And I've hundreds of people have DM'd me and said, I'm a huge Trump supporter, and I realized I was completely wrong about Palestine and blah, blah, blah. And it's so interesting to see. So going live, you know, you can do it on your own now, and a lot of these people will follow you. And the second you start talking about this topic, especially, it will go wild. So guys, if you can, whatever you can, throw some gifts real quick.
But you're not going to get paid from it. Like, wait, sorry, but you're not going to get paid from it.
What?
So this is like a high bar to me.
Oh, yeah. I mean, well, you can, but that's why I'm like, please go push it,
Try,
guys.
you can try.
Whatever gifts or anything you have.
Yeah, again, if anything comes my way, it helps, you know. But
right.
Yeah, I'm not expecting to make a career out of this.
No, and I think that we should start like promoting, like, I don't know, like educate, like paying, like, you know, not even like gifting people who are pro-Palestinian who are doing this. Like, I think it's so important because we see so many other creators on live getting like gifts and doing all of these things for like TikTok creators, and it's like cool. The money is like there, like people are spending the money. So why is it when we're spending hours and hours of educating, you should get paid for it? Like, this is real life, you know? So
there are tons of issues that I think people really should be talking more about and haven't been. The reason I got into this is that this conflict has been dragging on forever, and the solutions to it are just startlingly obvious, but no one wants to talk about this shit. But it's the same thing with, like, this country's been steadily drifting into fascism for the last 50 years, and people are just, like, finally starting to talk a little bit about it and still don't really get why and how. And they just think, well, if I vote for the Democrats, we won't turn into a fascist state. Like, that's bullshit. That's not going to fix it. There's a much bigger problem here. So there's a ton of things we should talk about that we just don't. And I'd love to spend more time talking about things like this.
Those are so freaking cool. The one that you sent, Dom, about like the princess one, I was like, huh? I couldn't even see the comments or anything. I was like, what? That was really pretty. Their scripts are so creative. The animation.
They're cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, there's a ton of things like this that, I mean, I got into this stuff in the first place because I want people to give a shit about the world.
Mm-hmm.
I want people to care about this. I mean, there are conflicts all around the world that we completely ignore. Genocides we continually ignore, and everyone just thinks that they're like, oh yeah, we got all over it's all over with the Holocaust. It's no bullshit. We continue to endorse this shit over and over and over again and ignore huge amounts of suffering. But we can fix this shit. We just have to talk about it. We have to get people involved. They have to, like, get out in the streets. I've actually loved seeing so many people out there in these protests and flags and whatnot. That has really made me happy here. I mean, people in the United States in particular, but in large parts of the Western world as a whole, there's a kind of learned helplessness. We've been taught that we're powerless, that we have to trust the politicians and just vote and they'll solve the problem. Bullshit. The only way politicians will ever do anything is if there's street power that's pushing them. You need people in the streets. They need to be willing to occupy the streets and shut down traffic. If you hurt the economy, politicians will do something about it. As long as it's safe, it's tame, it's organized, and it costs no one anything, they're not going to change a damn thing. But if you got, 20,000 people to shut down the 405 freeway, you see what I'm getting at here?
I always say this.
Care about these issues. We absolutely can make change in the world, and we absolutely can bring more peace in the world. But we have to care enough, and we have to start talking about these issues.
And I think what's and I'm sorry, last thing, I just want to say, sorry, Dom, I know you want to go to sleep. I know everyone is tired, but I just want to say, I think, so for example, I think I was 4 or 3 when I went to my first protest. Being born in this, you don't have a choice. You've been forced since your conception or your inception, or whatever the case is, to fight for humanity. The fact that we're on TikTok live begging to be viewed as people, as humans, it's insane to me. And so when we have and it's so important, I understand there's ignorance and then there's bigotry. And I hate bigotry is something I won't interact with. But when we look at the humanity, right, all these litmus tests that were given to Palestinians. Do you condemn Hamas? Do you, the Palestinians don't like gay people. Palestinians don't like women. Why are you, you wouldn't be accepted. All this bullshit. We've never done this before in the history of ever helping out with genocides, helping to end genocides. We've never done this litmus test on these people before we went in to help them. We didn't do this with the Holocaust. We didn't do this with the Armenian genocide. We didn't do a litmus test to see whether or not the people have outstanding human rights, right? And I think that it's really important that we're doing, it's only the case for Palestinians that we have to do this.
Right.
Sorry, y'all, for
no one seemed to have a problem with, there's just tons of places where we don't seem to have any problem at all with partisans. We don't have problems with people fighting back. It's the narratives around resistance and terror and whatnot are so political and so dishonest.
They want to know your cat's name.
Oh, this one? This is Minerva, or Minerva.
Minerva. Okay.
Minerva is my little Roman war goddess.
She's beautiful.
The one that's been hanging out by my feet is Socrates.
She's beautiful.
Well, I want to say thank you again for coming on live. Genuinely, really, really appreciate it. And if you guys want to, I'm going to do the last 20 seconds here, or a couple minutes, 2 minutes. But please, if you guys want him to come back, please throw whatever you guys can at him so we can keep doing this more and more, and he'll be more incentivized to also take time away to actually make videos, respond to questions. But please, thank you. You guys are going wild. Thank you so much. So please, don't give anything to me. Give it to him. Everything to him. I don't want it. Please, please, please. Thank you guys for everything. And McLovin, you want to say